I picture a landscape of mist and stone, where mountains rise like ancient sentinels above valleys wrapped in fog, and somewhere in the distance a single path winds upward through groves of pine and cryptomeria, their branches heavy with silence. The air here carries the scent of rain on cedar and wet earth, and something else, something harder to name. Perhaps it is the smell of iron, or the faint trace of camphor and lacquer drifting from structures hidden among the trees. There is a quality to this place that feels suspended, as though time moves differently here, where seasons pass in the turning of a leaf, the opening of a plum blossom, the first snow settling on a tiled roof. And in this slowness, in this patient unfolding, there exists a world shaped by ritual and precision, by codes older than memory, by the weight of a single word given and never forgotten. I find myself drawn to the image of a courtyard swept clean of debris, the ground covered in fine gravel that has been raked into patterns, concentric rings that circle outward from nothing, or perhaps from everything. And at the edge of this courtyard stands a figure, still as the stones themselves, wrapped in layers of dark fabric that absorb the morning light. The figure does not move, and yet there is movement in the stillness, a kind of readiness, like a bowstring drawn but not yet released. And I wonder what it means to stand so completely present, to inhabit a single moment with such absolute attention that the moment itself seems to deepen, to open into something larger. Around this courtyard, beyond the immediate circle of raked gravel, there are buildings of wood and paper, their architecture spare and elegant, with roof lines that curve gently upward at the corners, as though lifting toward the sky. And through the open screens I can glimpse interiors of profound simplicity. Tatami mats aligned with perfect care, a single scroll hanging in an alcove, ink strokes forming characters that speak of wind or mountain or the way of heaven. This is a world where every object has been chosen, where every placement matters, where the distance between a tea bowl and its accompanying ladle has been considered with the same gravity one might bring to matters of life and death. And perhaps, in some way, I am only beginning to understand. These things are not separate. The arrangement of objects and the conduct of a life, both arising from the same source, both expressions of something essential. I think of hands, calloused and strong, wrapping the handle of something long and curved with braided cord, the movements practiced 10,000 times until they are no longer movements, but breathing, until the separation between intention and action dissolves completely, and what remains is a kind of dance, ancient and new in every execution. The mist begins to lift from the valley, revealing terraced fields below, their edges sharp and geometric against the wild forest, and I realize this landscape itself is a collaboration between human will and natural form, neither dominating the other, but existing in a tension that creates beauty, the way a blade edge holds its keenness through the meeting of opposing forces. There are stories woven into this land, into the very soil and stone, stories of loyalty tested beyond endurance, of codes that govern not just action, but thought itself, of a class of warriors who were also poets, calligraphers, practitioners of tea ceremony, who understood that the same mind that could end a life in a single stroke must also know the precise angle at which to arrange a flower, the exact moment to pour water over powdered tea, And as I stand here in imagination, feeling the weight of mist on my skin, hearing the distant sound of a temple bell rolling across the valley, I sense that I am approaching something profound, not through force or speed, but through patient observation, through allowing the details to accumulate slowly, like snow building on a pine branch, until the branch bends and releases and returns to its original shape. The figure in the courtyard has not moved, or perhaps has moved in ways too subtle for casual observation. A shift of weight, a breath taken and released, the slight adjustment of fingers around polished wood, and I understand that I am witnessing a kind of meditation, though no one would call it that, a practice of becoming so completely what one is meant to be, that the distinction between self and purpose vanishes like morning mist. This is where we begin, in a courtyard swept clean, in the moment before movement, in the space between breaths, where an entire world waits to unfold. The story begins long before the word itself existed, in a time when this archipelago of islands was still finding its shape, still learning what it would become, and the people who lived here were organizing themselves into clans and territories, each valley a world unto itself, each mountain pass a boundary between different ways of being. In those early centuries, perhaps around the 7th or 8th hundred years after the Common Era began, the imperial court in the capital city modeled itself on the great civilizations across the sea, adopting their writing, their Buddhism, their concepts of governance and cosmic order. But the reality of power was always more complex than the elegant documents suggested, because beyond the capital, in the provinces, other forces were gathering strength. The land itself demanded a certain kind of person, someone who could protect rice fields from raiders, who could organize the defense of a village, who could ride and fight and command. And so there emerged a class of mounted warriors, skilled with the bow, comfortable in armor, bound to local lords by ties of obligation and mutual need. And these warriors were called by various names in those early days, but the essential pattern was already forming: the exchange of loyalty for protection, of service for status, of life itself for honor. I see them in my mind, these early fighters, not yet the refined figures of later centuries, but rough men on sturdy horses, their armor made of small iron plates laced together with leather cord, their bows of laminated wood and bamboo, powerful enough to pierce armor at distance. And they lived in a world where Buddhist teachings about the impermanence of life coexisted with the immediate need to defend, to fight, to kill when necessary. The great families began to consolidate their power, the Fujiwara in the court, but also the Taira and the Minamoto, clans with military strength, with networks of loyal warriors spread across provinces. And as the imperial government's authority weakened in the outlying regions, these warrior families became the true holders of power, the ones who could actually enforce decisions, collect taxes, maintain order. There was a moment, sometime in the middle of the 12th century, when the tension between the Taira and Minamoto clans finally broke into open warfare, and this conflict, known as the Genpei War, would reshape everything, would establish patterns that would endure for centuries, would create legends that would be told and retold until they became inseparable from history itself. The battles were fought on horseback, with arrows flying in clouds, with individual warriors calling out their lineages before engaging in single combat. because even in the midst of violence there were rules, there were proper forms, there were ways of conducting oneself that mattered as much as victory. And these warriors kept records of their deeds, had their exploits recorded in scrolls, because reputation, the memory of courage and skill, was a kind of immortality. I think of the Battle of Dan no Ura, fought in the narrow straits between islands, where the Taira clan made their final stand, their ships surrounded, their cause already lost. And the stories tell of the child emperor, barely more than an infant, being carried into the waves by his grandmother, the sacred sword and jewel and mirror disappearing into the dark water. And this image, this moment of absolute defeat, transformed into something dignified and terrible, would echo through the centuries that followed. The Minamoto emerged victorious, and their leader, Yoritomo, established something new, a military government separate from the imperial court, based not in the ancient capital, but in the eastern town of Kamakura, far from the refined culture of courtiers and priests. And he took the title of shogun, the generalissimo, the one who held real power while the emperor remained a sacred figurehead, a source of legitimacy, but not authority. This was the beginning of the bakufu, the tent government, so called because it was originally the headquarters of an army in the field. And with this new structure came a new emphasis on the warrior and his code, on the bond between lord and retainer, on the idea that there was a proper way to live, a path that combined martial skill with moral cultivation. The warriors of Kamakura were expected to be austere, to practice Zen meditation, to cultivate indifference to hardship and death, and the stories from this period emphasize their simplicity, their directness, their disdain for the elaborate courtly culture of the old capital. They were men of action, of loyalty tested in battle, of oaths that could not be broken without losing everything that made life meaningful. And yet, even here, even in this martial culture, there was an appreciation for beauty, for the cherry blossoms that bloomed and fell in a handful of days, for poetry that captured a moment of awareness, for the way moonlight looked on snow, because the very impermanence of life, the knowledge that death could come at any moment, made these fleeting beauties more precious, more worthy of attention. The Mongols came in the 13th century, great fleets sent by Kublai Khan to demand submission, and the warriors of Japan met them on the beaches of Kyushu, fought them in ways the Mongols had not anticipated, and when storms destroyed the invasion fleets, the warriors saw the hand of divine protection, the kamikaze, the divine wind, and their sense of being a people set apart, chosen, defended by the gods themselves, grew stronger. But the cost of this defense was enormous. Warriors who had fought expected reward, expected grants of land, and the bakufu could not provide what was expected because there were no new territories to distribute, no conquered lands to parcel out. And so the bonds began to strain. The system began to show its limitations. And in the confusion that followed, power fragmented. Provincial lords grew stronger. Central authority weakened. The country entered a period of near-constant civil war, lasting more than a century, where alliances shifted like wind, where brother fought brother, where the old certainties dissolved, and yet from this chaos, from this crucible of endless conflict, the warrior class refined itself, developed new skills, new strategies, new philosophies of combat and command. The castles grew larger, more sophisticated, no longer simple wooden fortifications, but massive structures of stone and wood, with multiple baileys and moats and walls designed to withstand siege, to project power, to serve as administrative centers for domains that were becoming small kingdoms. And around these castles gathered not just warriors, but craftsmen, merchants, farmers, entire communities organized around the principle of service to the Lord. I see the training grounds where young men learned to use the spear, the sword, the bow, where they practiced in all weather, in rain and snow and summer heat, until their bodies knew the movements without thought, until they could respond to attack with the same immediacy as flinching from fire. And this training was not just physical but spiritual, a forging of character, a preparation for death that made life more vivid, more present. The tea ceremony began to take its classic form during this period, brought from Zen temples into warrior households, and what might seem like a strange pairing, the man trained to kill, learning to whisk powdered tea with perfect form, was actually deeply coherent, because both practices required the same quality of attention, the same elimination of wasted motion, the same commitment to doing one thing completely with total presence. There were codes being written down, guidelines for proper conduct, instructions on how a warrior should comport himself in various situations, and these codes emphasized loyalty above all. The bond between lord and retainer was sacred, was more important than life itself, and stories circulated of warriors who followed their lords into death, who refused to outlive their masters, who saw in this loyalty a kind of perfection, a way of transcending the merely personal. The swords were changing, too, becoming more than just weapons. The bladesmiths learned to fold steel, to create edges of extraordinary sharpness backed by softer metal that could absorb shock. And these swords were given names, were treasured as heirlooms, were believed to embody the spirit of their makers and wielders, and the way a warrior wore his swords, the angle, the wrapping of the handle, all of this communicated status and intention. By the time the 16th century arrived, the warfare had become more organized, larger armies, more use of infantry, of firearms imported from European traders, and yet the ideals remained. The sense that there was a proper way to fight, a code that elevated combat beyond mere survival, that made of violence something aesthetic, terrible and beautiful at once. The great unifiers were emerging, warlords who dreamed of bringing the whole country under single rule, who combined military genius with political acumen, who understood that power required not just force but legitimacy, ritual, the appearance of divine favor. And they gathered around them the finest warriors, men whose reputations were known across provinces, whose skills were legendary, whose loyalty had been tested in 100 battles, and still the cherry blossoms fell, and still the tea was whisked in quiet rooms, and still the moon rose over castle walls, and the warriors wrote poems about impermanence, about the beauty of a world where nothing lasts, where every moment is singular and unrepeatable, where death gives meaning to life by making it finite, precious, urgent. The unification came slowly, through decades of warfare and negotiation, through strategic marriages and calculated betrayals, and when Tokugawa Ieyasu finally emerged victorious at the great battle of Sekigahara in the year 1600, He established a peace that would endure for more than 2.5 centuries, a peace enforced by the most sophisticated system of control ever devised in these islands. The new order required warriors to make a choice to become retainers of established lords, to accept stipends of rice instead of controlling land directly, to move from their country holdings into castle towns where they could be watched, managed, kept busy with bureaucratic duties and ritual obligations. And in making this choice, in accepting this transformation, they became something new, something that had never quite existed before. They were called samurai now, a word that meant simply those who serve, and service became the defining characteristic of their existence. Not the freedom of the mounted warrior riding across open country, but the disciplined attendance at court, the mastery of etiquette, the ability to conduct oneself with perfect propriety in situations governed by rules of bewildering complexity. I imagine a morning in a castle town during this long peace, the sun rising over tiled roofs, smoke beginning to drift from cooking fires, and in the samurai quarter, the houses arranged in strict hierarchy, the higher-ranking warriors closest to the castle, the lower ranks further out. A man rises before dawn, performs his ablutions, sits in meditation, and then begins the day's training. The sword practice is not preparation for battle, because there are no battles anymore, but rather a form of spiritual cultivation. He moves through kata, prearranged forms that have been passed down through generations, each movement precise, each transition flowing into the next. And the goal is not to defeat an opponent, but to perfect the form itself, to embody the principle, to make of the body an instrument of pure expression, his swords. And he carries two now. The longer katana and the shorter wakizashi are works of art, the blades forged by masters whose names are known across the country. The curve designed not just for cutting, but for a kind of terrible beauty, the way the light moves along the edge, the hamon, the temper line where hard steel meets soft, visible as a wave of brightness, each blade unique, each one signed by its maker. After practice he bathes, changes into formal dress, and makes his way to the castle for the day's duties, which might involve nothing more than sitting in attendance while his lord conducts business, being present as a sign of respect and readiness, and the hours pass in stillness, in the careful observation of protocol, in the management of a self that must never show inappropriate emotion, never reveal weakness, never forget for a moment the weight of obligation. The castle itself is a world of coded meanings. The layout of rooms, the decoration of sliding doors, the placement of the dais where the Lord sits, all communicate hierarchy, power, the elaborate structure of a society organized into rigid classes. And to navigate this world requires knowledge, study, the ability to read situations with perfect accuracy, because a misstep here, a breach of etiquette, can mean disgrace, loss of position, the destruction of a family's standing. And yet within this formality there is room for arts, for the cultivation of sensibility. The samurai is expected to be literate, to know the classics of Chinese and Japanese literature, to compose poetry in the 31-syllable form called waka, to appreciate the tea ceremony, the arrangement of flowers, the hanging of scrolls, all the refined accomplishments that separate the cultured warrior from the mere fighter. The tea ceremony in particular becomes almost an obsession, Entire schools develop around different approaches to the preparation and serving of tea, and a samurai might spend years studying the proper way to enter a tea room, to appreciate the scroll in the alcove, to admire the tea bowl, to whisk the bright green powder into froth, and this elaborate ritual, performed in a small space, with movements reduced to their essence, becomes a meditation on simplicity, on the beauty of humble things, on the presence required to do one thing completely. I see the tea room, its entrance deliberately low so that everyone must bow to enter, regardless of rank, the interior bare, except for the alcove with its scroll and flower arrangement, the hearth where water heats in an iron kettle, and the host moving with choreographed precision, every gesture meaningful, every pause measured, creating a temporary world where normal hierarchies dissolve, where what matters is only this moment, this bowl of tea, this gathering that will never occur again in exactly this way. The culture of the sword becomes increasingly refined, but also increasingly divorced from actual combat, because there is no combat, just the study of technique, the preservation of schools, each with its secret teachings, its special methods passed only from master to chosen students, and warriors train obsessively in these techniques, even though they will almost certainly never use them, because the training itself is the point, the forging of character through discipline. There are stories that circulate, legends of master swordsmen, of duels fought on bridges or in temple grounds, of techniques so perfect they could cut through anything, of awareness so refined it could detect killing intent before movement. And these stories become part of the culture, models to aspire toward, examples of what it means to achieve mastery. Even if the reality is mostly warriors sitting in castles, managing paperwork, trying to maintain dignity on stipends that are never quite enough. The 47 Ronin, their story becomes the defining legend of this era, how their lord was forced to commit ritual suicide after being provoked into drawing his sword in the shogun's palace, how his retainers became masterless. Ronin, how they plotted for nearly 2 years, pretending to be dissolute, scattered, forgotten, and then on a winter night they gathered, attacked the mansion of their enemy, took his head, and carried it to their master's grave, knowing that in fulfilling their duty they were signing their own death warrants. And when the shogunate finally ordered them to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, they did so with perfect composure and became immortal, their story told and retold in plays and prints and eventually films, because they embodied the ideal loyalty unto death, the fulfillment of obligation regardless of personal cost, the elevation of duty above life itself. And even now, even centuries later, people visit their graves, leave offerings, honor their memory. The ritual suicide itself becomes codified, formalized into a ceremony with specific requirements. The warrior, dressed in white, seated on white fabric, his final poem composed and read aloud, the short blade drawn across the abdomen in a specific pattern, the assistant standing ready to complete the act with a single stroke that severs the head. And this terrible practice is seen not as barbaric, but as the ultimate expression of self-control, the ability to face death with composure, to transform the moment of dying into art. I think of the preparation required, the mental state necessary to perform this act, and I realize it grows from the same root as the tea ceremony, the same cultivation of presence, the same elimination of everything but the immediate moment, the same aesthetic of simplicity and directness. Death as a performance, yes, but also death as the final statement of a life lived according to principle. The piece continues, generation after generation, and the samurai class begins to struggle with its purpose. They are warriors who do not fight. Their stipends buy less each year as merchants grow wealthy and samurai grow poor. They are forbidden to engage in commerce, forbidden to work with their hands, forbidden to do anything except serve and study and maintain their dignity, and the contradiction grows harder to sustain. Some become teachers, opening schools where they teach swordsmanship or other martial arts to merchants and farmers, something that would have been unthinkable in earlier times. Others become scholars, studying Confucian texts, developing elaborate theories of governance and ethics, trying to justify their position in a society that increasingly finds them irrelevant, and still others sink into poverty, into disgrace, selling their swords, abandoning their status, disappearing into the lower classes. But the ideal remains, the image of the perfect warrior, loyal, skilled, cultured, indifferent to death, and this ideal is taught to children, illustrated in books, enacted in theater, becomes part of the national imagination, even as the reality grows more complicated, more compromised, more distant from the heroic age that everyone knows is over. But no one wants to forget. The schools of martial arts proliferate, each claiming to preserve the authentic teachings, each with its own techniques and philosophies, and warriors train in empty rooms with wooden swords, practicing against invisible opponents, perfecting movements that will never be tested in actual combat. And there is something both admirable and tragic in this dedication, this commitment to excellence in something that has no practical purpose, that exists only for its own sake. The relationship with death becomes more philosophical, more abstract, less the immediate reality of the battlefield, and more a mental discipline, a way of approaching life by keeping death always in mind, memento mori as daily practice. And the texts written during this period emphasize that every moment might be the last, that the warrior must be ready to die at any instant, that this readiness, this acceptance, paradoxically makes life more vivid, more worth living, and still the cherry blossoms bloom and fall, and still the moon rises over castle walls, and still the tea is whisked in quiet rooms, and the samurai write in their journals about the difficulty of maintaining honor in a world that no longer values what they value, about the challenge of living according to old codes in new circumstances, about the beauty of a life dedicated to something beyond mere survival or comfort or success. The world beyond these islands was changing. Ships from distant countries began appearing with increasing frequency, first the Portuguese and Spanish, then the Dutch and English, bringing firearms and Christianity and new ideas about commerce and governance, and the shogunate responded by closing the country, expelling foreigners, executing Christians, allowing only the most limited trade through a single port, trying to freeze time, to preserve the order they had so carefully constructed. And for a while it worked. The isolation held. Generations passed without significant contact with the outside world. And the samurai continued their rituals, their training, their service to lords who served greater lords in an elaborate hierarchy that ultimately led to the shogun in Edo, the great city that would later be called Tokyo, where hundreds of thousands lived, where the samurais were required to spend alternating years, leaving their families as hostages against rebellion. But the world does not stop, and in the middle of the 19th century, black ships appeared in the harbor, American warships with cannons that could destroy coastal fortifications from a distance the Japanese guns could not match, and the commander demanded that the country open to trade, threatened bombardment if refused, and the shogunate, facing technology they could not counter, agreed to terms that everyone understood meant the end of the old order. I see the confusion of this moment, the realization that everything the samurai had believed about their superiority, their divine protection, their mastery of warfare, was no longer true, that the world had moved on while they practiced with swords, that their elaborate culture of martial discipline was irrelevant against steam engines and rifled artillery, and the question became urgent. What now? What is the purpose of the samurai in this new world? Some argued for resistance, for attacking the foreigners regardless of cost, for maintaining the old ways even unto destruction, and others saw that change was necessary, that Japan must learn from the West, must adopt their technology, their organization, their methods, or be colonized like so much of Asia was being colonized. And this division, this fundamental disagreement about the path forward, led to violence. The country descended into civil war again, samurai fighting samurai, some loyal to the shogun, others to the emperor, but really fighting about whether to embrace modernity or resist it. And the battles were strange hybrid affairs. Men in traditional armor charging Western-style rifle formations, cavalry attacks met with cannon fire, the old ways literally dying in the smoke and chaos. The emperor's faction won, backed ironically by the most progressive elements, the ones most committed to westernization, and they moved the emperor from Kyoto to Edo, renamed the city Tokyo, and began a program of modernization so rapid it still seems astonishing, within a generation transforming from a feudal society to an industrial power, building railroads, factories, a modern army and navy, sending students abroad to learn, inviting foreign experts to teach, and the samurai class was abolished. Their stipends ended, their monopoly on martial arts dissolved, their swords banned from public carrying except for ceremonial purposes, and thousands of men who had defined themselves by their status, their lineage, their connection to an ancient warrior tradition, suddenly found themselves adrift, without purpose, without the structure that had given meaning to every aspect of their lives. Some adapted, became officers in the new army, bureaucrats in the modernizing government, businessmen in the emerging economy, teachers in the new schools. They cut their top knots, put on Western clothes, learned to use rifles and write reports and conduct themselves according to new protocols that emphasized efficiency over ceremony, and in doing so, preserved something of the old discipline, the old commitment to duty, even as the forms changed completely. Others could not accept it, saw the changes as betrayal, as the destruction of everything sacred, and there were rebellions, most famously in Satsuma, where thousands of former samurai rose against the government, fought with swords against conscript armies with modern weapons, and were destroyed, the last battle ending with a handful of survivors committing ritual suicide rather than surrender, and this defeat, this final military failure, marked the absolute end of the samurai as a functional class. But something curious happened. Even as the samurai disappeared as a social reality, their image, their ideals, their aesthetics began to spread more widely. The new government promoted Bushido, the way of the warrior, as a national ethic, something all Japanese should aspire to, not just the old warrior class and the values of loyalty, self-discipline, acceptance of hierarchy, willingness to die for a cause. These became part of how the nation understood itself. The martial arts transformed, became ways of self-cultivation rather than practical combat skills. Judo and Kendo developed as sports, as educational disciplines, stripped of their lethal applications but retaining their emphasis on form, on the development of character through physical practice. And these arts spread internationally, became one of Japan's most recognizable cultural exports, a way for people everywhere to touch something of that samurai ideal. I think of the photographs from this transitional period. Men in traditional dress standing stiffly before the camera, swords at their sides, faces serious, formal, and beside them the same men in Western military uniforms or business suits, and the contrast is jarring, shows the violence of the transformation, the speed with which an entire way of life was abandoned, or rather transmuted into something new, something that claimed continuity with the past while being fundamentally different. The swords remained, became art objects, family treasures, symbols of a heritage that could no longer be loosely lived, but could be remembered, honored, preserved in museums and private collections. And the swordsmiths continued their work, no longer making weapons for war, but creating pieces for contemplation, for ceremony, for the preservation of techniques that had been refined over centuries. And in this transformation, the sword became perhaps more purely aesthetic than it had ever been. The literature of this period is full of nostalgia, of samurai remembering their youth, writing memoirs of the old days, of conflicts and loyalties and moments of decision. And these memoirs are tinged with melancholy, with the knowledge that they are describing a world that is gone, that will never return, that exists now only in memory and story. And there is something deeply human in this, the need to record, to testify, to say this is how it was, this is what we believed, this is what we lost. The 20th century brought new transformations, the military rise of Japan, the wars in China and eventually across the Pacific, and the Bushido ideal was conscripted into service, used to motivate soldiers, to justify fanatical resistance, to create a culture where surrender was unthinkable and death in battle was the highest honor, and the samurai values that had once been about personal discipline and aesthetic refinement were twisted into something harder, more absolute, more dangerous. And after defeat, after the atomic bombs and the occupation, there was a reckoning with this heritage, a questioning of these values. Were they responsible for the catastrophe? Had the samurai ideal led the nation into destruction, or had it been corrupted, misused, turned into something it was never meant to be? And these questions did not have simple answers, still do not have simple answers, but the fascination remained, grew, if anything, stronger. The image of the samurai entered global consciousness through films, through martial arts, through a general sense that here was a culture that had achieved something remarkable, a fusion of martial prowess and aesthetic sensitivity, of violence and beauty, of discipline and spontaneity that seemed to offer a model, or at least a provocation, a way of thinking about honor and duty and the conduct of life. I see now how the story has moved from those early warriors on horseback, rough men in a rough age, through the elaborate refinements of the long peace, the transformation into something like a permanent performance of warrior identity, and then the sudden collapse, the adaptation, the preservation in altered form, and through all of this, through all these changes, something persists, some thread of continuity, some set of questions about how to live, how to face death, how to find meaning in discipline and service. The tea ceremony continued, practiced now by people who have never held a sword, who live in a world of technology and democracy and international commerce, and yet the movements are the same. The attention to detail, the creation of a space apart where what matters is only this moment, this bowl of tea, this gathering of people who will never be together in exactly this way again. The martial arts dojos still teach, still emphasize the perfection of form, the development of character, the respect for tradition, and students bow before beginning practice. Perform kata that were old when their great-grandparents were young, and find in this practice something they cannot quite name, some quality of presence, of commitment, of connection to something larger than themselves. And the swords are still forged, still using traditional methods, folding the steel, shaping the curve, creating the hamon, and collectors still prize them, still study them, still see in these objects something more than metal, some embodiment of human striving toward perfection, toward the creation of beauty that is also functional, that serves a purpose even if that purpose is no longer needed. The landscape remains, the mountains and valleys, the rice fields and forests, the temples and shrines, though the castles are mostly gone, destroyed in wars or earthquakes or the simple passage of time. And the cherry blossoms still bloom and fall, still marking the seasons, still reminding anyone who pauses to notice that beauty and impermanence are not opposites, but aspects of the same truth. And yet there is something more to understand, something that goes beyond the historical narrative, beyond the rise and fall of a warrior class, something about the nature of discipline itself, about what it means to dedicate a life to the perfection of form, to the embodiment of principles that may have no practical application, but possess their own strange necessity. I think about the master swordsman standing in an empty dojo, performing a kata he has practiced 10,000 times, and will practice 10,000 more, not because he expects to fight, not because anyone is watching, but because the form itself demands completion, because there is a rightness to the movement when it is executed perfectly, a kind of truth that reveals itself only through endless repetition, through the grinding away of everything extraneous until only the essential remains. This is not about achievement in any ordinary sense, not about winning or losing, not about recognition or reward, but about a relationship with excellence that is almost devotional, the way a monk might approach prayer, the way a calligrapher approaches the stroke of a brush. And in this approach, there is a philosophy, a way of understanding what it means to be human, to have a body, to move through time, to make choices about how to spend the brief years we are given. The tea ceremony master writes that the encounter is once in a lifetime. Ichigos, Ichia, even if the same people gather in the same room tomorrow, it will not be the same, cannot be the same, because time has moved, because we have changed, because this moment, this exact configuration of people and place and light and breath will never occur again. And knowing this, really knowing it, changes how we attend to the present. And this too is part of the samurai inheritance, this awareness of impermanence, this sense that death is always present, not as something morbid or frightening, but as a fact that gives weight to everything, that makes the cherry blossom more beautiful, precisely because it falls, that makes the morning light more precious precisely because evening will come, that makes each encounter significant precisely because it will end. I see the connection between the warrior's readiness for death and the poet's attention to the moment, both arising from the same source, both requiring the same quality of presence, and I understand that the sword and the tea bowl are not opposites, but complementary tools, different ways of engaging with the fundamental questions, different practices leading toward the same realization. There is a story about a famous swordsman who was also a master of tea, and when asked how the two arts related, he said that in both you must give yourself completely to the moment. In both you must eliminate all thought of before and after. In both you must act with total commitment while remaining perfectly calm. And the movements of preparing tea, the precise angle of the ladle, the exact pressure of the whisk, these require the same mastery of body and mind as drawing the sword in a single fluid motion that ends a life. The gardens, too, speak this language, the arrangement of rocks that looks natural but is entirely contrived, the pruning of trees to suggest great age or wind-swept exposure, the careful placement of stepping stones to control the pace of walking, to direct attention, to create moments of revelation. And walking through these gardens is itself a meditation, a practice of seeing, of allowing beauty to work on consciousness in ways that bypass explanation. And I realize that what we are approaching here, what all of these practices point toward, is a way of being in the world that is simultaneously fully engaged and completely detached, that acts with total commitment while knowing that all action is provisional, temporary, that the outcome cannot be controlled. And this paradox, this holding of opposites, is perhaps the deepest teaching, the thing that cannot be explained but only experienced through practice. The calligrapher knows that when the brush touches paper, there is no going back, no correction, no second chance. The stroke is either right or it is not. And this irreversibility, this commitment to the moment of action, trains the mind to be ready, to wait for the exact right instant, and then to move without hesitation, without second guessing, with the whole being unified in a single gesture. And is this not how the samurai was supposed to live? Every moment potentially the last, every action carried out with complete attention, with the knowledge that there are no rehearsals, no do-overs, that life happens once, that we are always standing at the brush's tip, at the moment before the stroke, and what we do in that moment reveals everything about who we are. The armor in the museum is beautiful, the lacquered plates laced together with silk cord, the helmet with its fearsome mask, the whole ensemble a work of art that took months to create, and it was worn into battle, was functional protection, but it was also statement, declaration, and an insistence that even violence could be conducted with attention to form, to beauty, to the proper way of doing things. And This insistence, this refusal to separate the aesthetic from the practical, seems increasingly rare, increasingly worth preserving, even if only as memory, as possibility. I think of the young person today in Tokyo or New York or Sao Paulo, putting on the hakama, the divided skirt worn for martial arts practice, picking up the wooden sword and bowing before beginning the kata, and in that moment connecting with something that stretches back centuries, embodying a tradition that has survived the end of the society that created it, that persists because it offers us something people need, some counterweight to the acceleration of modern life, some practice of slowness, of attention, of devotion to form. And perhaps this is the final transformation, the samurai becoming not a class but a practice, not a social position but a set of the techniques for cultivating presence, for developing character, for approaching life with seriousness and grace. And in this transformation, something is lost, certainly the organic connection to a living culture, the embeddedness in a total way of life. But something is also preserved, perhaps even strengthened, the essential teaching, the core insight, freed from its original context and available to anyone willing to undertake the discipline. The moon rises over the valley, just as it did centuries ago, when warriors wrote poems by its light, when they sat in castle towers contemplating impermanence, when they understood themselves to be living between beauty and violence, between the cherry blossom and the blade, and the moon does not care about our interpretations, our longings, our attempts to grasp what cannot be held. It simply rises, crosses the sky, sets, and rises again, and I find myself returning to that image from the beginning, the figure in the courtyard, standing in absolute stillness. And I understand now that this stillness is not emptiness, but fullness, not absence, but total presence, the gathering of attention into a single point, the unification of body and mind and spirit that precedes action, or that is itself a kind of action, the most fundamental action, the choice to be here, now, completely. The gravel has been raked into patterns that will be disturbed by wind, by rain, by the passage of feet, and tomorrow someone will rake it again, will create the same patterns or slightly different ones. And this is not futile, not Sisyphean, but rather a recognition that order is temporary, that maintenance is continuous, that perfection exists only in the moment of its creation and then begins immediately to decay, and that this decay is not failure, but the nature of things, the way the world works, the truth that must be accepted and worked with rather than denied. The sun is lower now, the shadows longer, and the quality of light has changed, has become softer, more golden, the way it does in late afternoon when the day begins to turn toward evening, and there is a peace in this turning, in the inevitability of it, in the way darkness follows light, follows darkness, in an endless cycle that neither hurries nor delays. I hear, or imagine I hear, the sound of a temple bell, its tone deep and resonant, rolling across the valley, fading slowly into silence, and in that fading there is something complete, something that needs no addition, no elaboration, just the sound, and the silence after the sound, and the awareness that receives both. The path winds down from the mountains, through the forests, past the rice fields, toward the sea, and somewhere on that path, or perhaps beside it, there is a stone marker, weathered by centuries of rain and snow, the characters carved into its surface barely visible, and it marks nothing or everything, a place where someone once paused, looked back, looked forward, and continued walking. And I am walking now too, in imagination, in memory, in the space between what was and what is, carrying with me all that has been offered, the warriors and the poets, the tea masters and the swordsmiths, the cherry blossoms and the moon, the discipline and the beauty, the codes and the contradictions, all of it settling like snow, layer upon layer, until the shape of something emerges, not complete but suggestive, not finished but present. The wind moves through the pines, a sound like water, like breathing, like the passage of time made audible, and I am listening, just listening, as the day fades, as the story completes itself, as the final words arrange themselves like stones in a garden, like the last stroke of a brush on paper, decisive and irreversible and right. The mist returns to the valley, soft and white and forgiving, covering everything, erasing distinctions. And in this erasure there is rest, there is completion, there is the quiet sense of something finished, not ended but fulfilled, returned to the silence from which it emerged, the same silence that waits beneath all words, all stories, all attempts to capture what moves too quickly to be caught, what lives too fully to be contained. And so, the courtyard empty now, the gravel patterns dissolving in darkness, the figure gone or merged with shadow, and only the mountain remains, and the valley, and the sound of water somewhere in the distance, flowing as it has always flowed, as it will continue to flow, long after these words have faded, long after the story has been forgotten, long after everything we name and treasure has returned to earth, to stone, to the great silence that holds all things. There's a particular quality to the air when standing before something that once moved, when the motion has stopped, but the memory of it lingers in the metal and glass, in the curves that were shaped by wind and purpose. And tonight, I find myself in such a place where the history of movement itself seems to rest. The dim light falls across surfaces that were once polished to a shine, across chrome that caught the reflections of passing landscapes, across paint that wore the dust of 1,000 different roads. And in this stillness, there is something almost sacred, as if each machine here holds within it not just mechanics, not just engineering, but the dreams of those who imagined that the world could be crossed in new ways, that distance itself could be conquered. I move slowly between them, these vessels of transformation, and I think about how humanity has always been restless, always seeking to move faster, to go farther, to break free from the limitations that once seemed absolute. And here, in the presence of these automobiles, I can trace that restlessness back through decades, back through generations, back to a time when the very idea of a self-propelled vehicle seemed like something from the realm of fantasy. The metal is cool to the touch, smooth in some places, textured in others where time has left its mark, and I wonder about the hands that first shaped these forms, the minds that puzzled over problems that had never been solved before, the inventors and tinkerers and dreamers who looked at the horse-drawn carriages of their time and asked, what if we could harness power in a new way? What if we could create something that moved by its own force? What if we could change not just how we travel, but how we live, how we see the world, how we understand our place in it? The automobiles around me span more than a century of human ingenuity, and each one tells a story, not just of the machine itself, but of the era that created it, of the people who built it, of the roads it traveled and the journeys it made possible. And as I stand here, I feel the weight of all those stories, the accumulated knowledge, the failures and triumphs, the gradual evolution from the simplest mechanical concepts to the sophisticated vehicles that would eventually fill every corner of the modern world. There's something almost musical about the way these machines are arranged, each one a note in a longer composition, and the melody they create together is the story of progress itself, of how one idea builds upon another, how each innovation opens the door to something new, how the impossible becomes possible, and then becomes ordinary, and then becomes the foundation for the next impossible thing. I think about the roads these vehicles knew, the cobblestones and dirt paths, the early highways that stretched across landscapes that had never been so easily crossed, the bridges and tunnels that were built to accommodate them, the entire infrastructure that grew up around this new form of transportation, transforming not just how people moved, but where they lived, where they worked, how they spent their time. The air here carries a faint scent, old leather perhaps, or the lingering ghost of oil and gasoline, the materials that made this revolution possible. And I breathe it in, this scent of history, and I feel myself settling into the rhythm of this exploration, into the slow unfolding of a story that spans generations. Each automobile here is a monument, not in the grandiose sense, but in the way it marks a moment in time, a particular solution to a particular problem, a step forward in the long journey from the first experimental vehicles to the machines that would change civilization itself. And I want to understand that journey, to trace it carefully, to see how each piece fits into the larger whole. The shadows lengthen across metal and glass, and in this gentle dimness, I can almost see beyond the physical forms, can almost perceive the ideas themselves, the concepts that drove this evolution, the questions that demanded answers, the curiosity that refused to accept that things had to remain as they always had been. And so I begin to look back, to move slowly through time, to find the origins of this transformation, to understand how humanity first learned to move under its own power, to see the world through the eyes of those who lived when the automobile was not yet a reality, when it was still a dream waiting to be realized. The story begins long before the automobile itself, in workshops and laboratories scattered across Europe, where inventors and engineers were wrestling with a question that had occupied human minds for centuries: how to create a machine that could move itself, that could carry people and goods without the need for horses or human muscle. And the answer, when it finally came, emerged not from a single breakthrough, but from a gradual accumulation of ideas, each one building upon the last. In the late 1700s, because the concept of mechanical power was still in its infancy, and yet already there were those who dreamed of self-propelled vehicles, who sketched designs in candlelight, who imagined contraptions that could harness the power of steam, that emerging force that was beginning to transform industry, to drive mills and factories. And some wondered, could it also drive a carriage? The first attempts were crude, almost comically so by modern standards, great lumbering machines that huffed and wheezed, that required enormous amounts of fuel to move even short distances, but they moved, And that was the miracle. That was the proof that the dream was not impossible. Nicolas Joseph Cugnot, a French military engineer, created what many consider the first true self-propelled vehicle in 1769, a steam-powered tricycle designed to haul artillery. It was massive, ungainly, difficult to control, and during one demonstration it crashed into a wall, earning the dubious distinction of being involved in the world's first automobile accident. But it worked. It moved under its own power. And that was enough to plant a seed. For decades after, inventors across Europe continued to experiment with steam power, creating vehicles that were more curiosity than practical transportation. They were too heavy, too slow, too expensive, too dangerous. The boilers required constant attention. The water had to be replenished. The coal or wood consumed voraciously. And yet each iteration taught something new, revealed another piece of the puzzle. The 19th century brought refinement, brought new materials and new manufacturing techniques, and slowly, very slowly, the steam carriage began to evolve. In Britain, engineers created vehicles that could carry passengers along designated routes, early precursors to buses, running on roads that were not yet prepared for such machines, raising dust, frightening horses, causing concern among those who saw them as dangerous novelties. But steam, for all its power, carried limitations that seemed insurmountable. The weight of the boiler and fuel, the time required to build up pressure, the constant risk of explosion, and so minds turned to other possibilities, other ways to harness energy, other methods of propulsion. Electric power emerged as an intriguing alternative in the mid-1800s. Batteries were improving, motors were becoming more efficient, and the electric vehicle offered something the steam carriage could not: silence, cleanliness, ease of operation, no fire to tend, no boiler to manage, just the smooth, quiet surge of electrical current translated into motion. By the 1880s and 90s, electric vehicles were appearing in cities across Europe and America. Elegant carriages that glided through streets without the noise and smoke of their steam-powered cousins. They were particularly popular among wealthy urban dwellers who appreciated their refinement, their simplicity, their lack of odor and vibration. Thomas Parker in England, William Morrison in America, Camille Janazzi in Belgium. These names and others pushed the boundaries of what electric vehicles could do. Janazzi's TP torpedo-shaped La Jamais Contente became the first vehicle to exceed 100 kilometers per hour in 1899, a speed that seemed almost unimaginable, that hinted at possibilities yet to come. But electricity, too, had its limitations. The batteries were heavy. Their range was limited. Recharging took hours, and outside the cities, where electrical infrastructure did not yet exist, the electric vehicle was impractical, and so the search continued for a power source that could combine the best qualities of both steam and electricity, that could provide range and speed and convenience all at once. The answer, though few recognized it at first, lay in a fuel that had been known for centuries but never properly harnessed: petroleum, that dark liquid that seeped from the ground in certain places, that burned with intense heat, that contained within it an extraordinary concentration of energy. And the key to unlocking that energy was the internal combustion engine. The concept was not new. Inventors had been experimenting with internal combustion since the early 1800s, creating engines that burned over various fuels inside cylinders, that used the expanding gases to push pistons that converted that linear motion into rotational force. But making such an engine practical, making it reliable and efficient, that was the challenge. Etienne Lenoir in France created a working gas engine in 1860 and attached it to a crude vehicle that managed to travel a few kilometers. It was inefficient, consuming enormous amounts of fuel, but it demonstrated potential. It showed that internal combustion could indeed power a vehicle. Nikolaus Otto, a German engineer, improved upon these early designs, creating in 1876 a four-stroke engine that would become the template for most engines that followed: intake, compression, combustion, exhaust, a cycle that repeated thousands of times per minute, each explosion of fuel and air driving the piston down, each stroke part of a continuous rhythm that could sustain motion. And then came the 1880s, a decade that would prove pivotal when multiple inventors working independently began to create vehicles powered by these new engines, vehicles that burned petroleum distillates, gasoline, or benzene, fuels that were portable, energy-dense, quick to ignite. Carl Benz, working in Mannheim, Germany, assembled what is often considered the first true automobile, the motor wagon, patented in 1886. It was a three-wheeled vehicle, spindly and delicate-looking, with a single-cylinder four-stroke engine mounted at the rear, producing less than 1 horsepower, capable of reaching perhaps 16 kilometers per hour. And yet, it was complete. It was functional. It could be started and driven and stopped. It was not just an experiment, but a vehicle. Benz's wife, Bertha, would prove the vehicle's practicality in a way her husband never imagined. In 1888, without telling Carl, she took the motor wagon and her 2 teenage sons on a journey of over 100 kilometers from Mannheim to Pforzheim to visit her mother. It was the first long-distance automobile journey, and along the way she encountered every challenge that early motorists would come to know. The engine overheated and had to be cooled with water from streams. The fuel line clogged, and she cleaned it with her hat pin. The brakes wore out, and a cobbler helped fashion new leather pads. She bought fuel, Ligroin, a petroleum solvent, from pharmacies along the route. No gas stations existed yet. This journey did more to prove the automobile's potential than any demonstration or exhibition could have done. It showed that these machines could be practical, could serve a real purpose, could take people where they wanted to go, albeit with patience and resourcefulness. Meanwhile, also in Germany, Gottlieb Daimler and Wilhelm Maybach were pursuing their own path. They had worked with Nikolaus Otto, but broke away to develop their own engine designs, creating a compact, high-speed engine that could be adapted to various vehicles. In 1885, Daimler attached one of these engines to a wooden bicycle, creating what might be called the first motorcycle, and soon after, he and Maybach were installing their engines into carriages, into boats, experimenting with every application they could imagine. Their engines were more advanced than Benz's in some ways, running at higher speeds, producing more power for their size, and they licensed their designs to others, spreading the technology, making it available to a growing community of inventors and entrepreneurs who saw the potential in this new form of transportation. Across Europe, workshops and small factories began producing automobiles, each maker bringing their own variations. their own improvements. Some favored chain drives, others belt drives, some preferred water cooling, others air cooling. There were no standards yet, no established best practices, just experimentation and innovation, each builder learning from their own mistakes and occasionally from each other. In France, where an enthusiasm for mechanical innovation had long flourished, the automobile found particularly fertile ground. Armand Peugeot began building cars using Daimler engines in 1890. Émile Levasseur and René Panhard created their own designs, placing the engine at the front rather than the rear, a configuration that would become standard. These French manufacturers were among the first to see the automobile not just as a novelty, but as a product, something that could be sold to customers, that could become a business. And the customers came slowly at first, wealthy enthusiasts mostly, people who had the money to spend on an expensive and unreliable machine, who had the time to tinker with it when it broke down, who saw it as a sport, an adventure, a way to be at the forefront of modernity. They formed clubs, organized tours and races, created a culture around the automobile, even as the automobile itself was still finding its form. The races were particularly important. They pushed the technology forward, rewarded innovation, demonstrated what was possible. The Paris to Bordeaux race of 1895, covering over 1,200 kilometers, showed that automobiles could handle long distances, could average speeds of 24 kilometers per hour over challenging roads, and the winner, Émile Levasseur, drove alone for 48 hours, proving not just the machine's endurance, but the human spirit that accompanied this new age of mobility. By the turn of the 20th century, the automobile was no longer a curiosity confined to European workshops. It had crossed the Atlantic, had found new champions in America, where vast distances and an industrial spirit created perfect conditions for its evolution. And it was there, in a country still building its identity, that the automobile would transform from a plaything of the wealthy into something that could touch the lives of ordinary people. The American landscape was different from Europe. The cities were farther apart. The roads were fewer and often rougher, and there was a frontier mentality, a belief that anything could be achieved through determination and innovation. Dozens of small companies sprang up, each one claiming to build the best automobile, each one competing for a market that was still defining itself. Steam still had its advocates in America. The Stanley brothers, Francis and Freeland, built steam cars that were fast and powerful, setting speed records, proving that steam technology had not yet exhausted its potential. Their vehicles could accelerate smoothly, could climb hills with ease, but they still required water and fuel, still needed time to build up steam pressure, still carried the complexity that would ultimately limit their appeal. Electric vehicles, too, found a strong market, especially among women, who were told that the gasoline cars were too difficult to start, too dirty to operate. The electric offered refinement, predictability. You simply turned it on and it went, no cranking, no adjustment of fuel mixture, no intimate knowledge of mechanical temperament required. And in cities where charging stations were available, where trips were short and predictable, the electric automobile seemed like it might be the future. But gasoline, that volatile liquid with its sharp, distinctive smell, that fuel that could be transported in cans and poured into a tank, that required no elaborate preparation, no waiting, just ignition and combustion and immediate power. Gasoline was winning, slowly but decisively, and the man who would cement that victory, who would make the gasoline automobile not just popular, but ubiquitous, was watching and learning from all of these developments. Henry Ford, a farmer's son from Michigan, had been obsessed with machines since childhood. He had worked as an engineer for the Edison Illuminating Company, had built experimental cars in a workshop behind his home, had founded and lost control of 2 automobile companies before finally, in 1903, establishing the Ford Motor Company. And he had a vision that was different from most of his competitors. He did not want to build cars for the wealthy. He wanted to build a car that ordinary people could afford, a car that farmers and workers could buy, a car that would bring mobility to the masses. His first efforts were conventional enough, models labeled with letters, each one an improvement on the last. But he was learning, studying manufacturing techniques, observing how efficiency could be improved, how costs could be reduced. And in 1908, he introduced the Model T, a vehicle that would change everything. The Model T was not elegant, it was not fast, it was not luxurious, but it was practical, it was reliable. It was simple enough that owners could repair it themselves. And most importantly, Ford had a plan to make it affordable. He would standardize the design, would manufacture in volume, would find every possible way to reduce the cost of production, and then he would pass those savings to the customer. The price when it was introduced was $850. Expensive for most Americans. But Ford was just beginning. He implemented moving assembly lines borrowed from meat packing plants where carcasses moved past workers who each performed a specific task. He applied this principle to automobile production, bringing the work to the workers, eliminating wasted motion, breaking down complex tasks into simple repetitive actions that could be performed quickly and consistently. The results were extraordinary. Assembly time for a Model T dropped from 12 hours to just 93 minutes. Production soared, costs plummeted, and Ford kept reducing the price. By 1915, it was $440. By 1925, it was under $300, within reach of the very workers who built it. Ford famously paid his workers $5 a day, twice the typical wage, not just out of generosity, but because he understood that his workers were also his customers, that if they could afford to buy cars, they would, and the cycle would sustain itself. The Model T became a phenomenon. Over 15 million were built between 1908 and 1927. They filled American roads, transformed rural life, allowed farmers to reach towns and markets that had been distant, allowed families to visit relatives who lived counties away, allowed young people to court beyond their immediate neighborhoods. The automobile was reshaping society, redefining what was possible, changing the very fabric of American life. And it was not just transportation that changed. Entire industries emerged to support this new reality. Gas stations appeared first as simple pumps outside general stores, then as dedicated facilities. Oil companies expanded, refineries multiplied. Roads that had been adequate for horses and wagons were suddenly inadequate. Governments began paving, began creating highways, began building the infrastructure that automobiles demanded. Tires evolved from fragile rubber that punctured constantly to more durable compounds. Inner tubes gave way to more reliable designs. Tread patterns were developed, and companies like Goodyear and Firestone grew into giants, providing the rubber that connected these machines to the road, that made their motion possible. Europe, meanwhile, was following a different path. There, the automobile remained more exclusive, more expensive. Manufacturers focused on quality and performance rather than mass production. Companies like Rolls-Royce in Britain built vehicles that were masterpieces of engineering and craftsmanship, where every part was carefully fitted, where silence and smoothness were paramount, where the car was as much a statement of status as a means of transportation. In Germany, Mercedes had emerged from the Daimler company, building powerful, sophisticated vehicles, and there was Opel and Adler and many smaller manufacturers, each one serving a market that valued engineering excellence, that appreciated precision, that saw the automobile as something more than mere utility. Italy developed its own distinct character. Companies like Fiat brought some mass production, but also Alfa Romeo and Lancia, builders who emphasized style and performance, who created vehicles with personalities, with soul, where driving was not just about getting from one place to another, but about the experience itself, the connection between human and machine. France, which had been so instrumental in the automobile's early development, continued to innovate. Citroën introduced mass production techniques to Europe, while Bugatti created works of art on wheels, vehicles that were as beautiful as they were fast, that blurred the line between engineering and sculpture. The 1920s brought refinement to the automobile. Closed bodies became common, protecting occupants from weather. Electric starters replaced hand cranks, eliminating the dangerous and exhausting task of manually starting the engine. Transmissions gained synchronizers, making gear changes smoother, brakes improved. Four-wheel systems replacing the rear-only braking of earlier vehicles, making cars safer, more controllable. Luxury manufacturers pushed boundaries. Duesenberg in America built vehicles of extraordinary power and elegance. Hispano-Suiza in Spain created engines of legendary smoothness. Bentley in Britain combined speed with endurance, winning races at Le Mans, proving that performance and reliability need not be mutually exclusive. The automobile was maturing, finding its form. The basic layout that Panhard and Levasseur had pioneered, engine in front, driving wheels at rear, was now standard. Bodies were becoming more aerodynamic, more comfortable. Innovations like balloon tires made rides smoother. Hydraulic brakes provided better stopping power. The rough, primitive vehicles of the early years were giving way to machines that could travel long distances in relative comfort. Radio arrived in cars in the 1920s, connecting drivers to the world even as they moved through it. Heaters made winter driving bearable. Improved lighting extended the useful hours. Each innovation expanding the automobile's role, making it more integral to daily life. The Great Depression slowed but did not stop this progress. People still needed transportation, still wanted the freedom that automobiles provided. Manufacturers adapted, offered smaller, more economical models, competed on price and efficiency, and when the economy recovered, the industry surged back, stronger than before. By the 1930s, the automobile had achieved a kind of maturity. The basic engineering challenges had been solved. What remained was refinement, optimization, making cars faster, more comfortable, more reliable, more beautiful. Styling became increasingly important. Streamlining was all the rage. Vehicles took on flowing shapes, curves that suggested speed even when standing still. Chrysler introduced the airflow in 1934, a radically aerodynamic design that was ahead of its time. Too radical for many buyers, but influential nonetheless, showing what was possible when form followed function, when designers thought seriously about how air flowed over and around a moving vehicle. The Volkswagen emerged in Germany. Ferdinand Porsche's design for a people's car, commissioned by the Nazi government but based on principles of simplicity and efficiency, a rear engine layout, air cooling, a rounded shape that would become one of the most recognizable silhouettes in automotive history, though its mass production would not come until after the coming war, and war was coming, the storm clouds gathering over Europe. And when it arrived, the automobile industry would be transformed once again, turned to military production, to trucks and tanks and staff cars. The assembly lines that had built Model Ts and Fiats and Opels, now building instruments of war, and the world would emerge from that conflict changed, the automobile along with it, ready for a new era, an era of expansion and innovation that would surpass everything that had come before. But that transformation still lay ahead. And for now, in this moment of reflection, I find myself thinking about those decades when the automobile was young, when it was still proving itself, when every journey was an adventure, when the simple act of traveling from one town to another required planning and courage and a willingness to get one's hands dirty. The world that emerged from the Second World War was transformed in countless ways, and the automobile industry reflected those transformations. Factories that had built bombers and tanks returned to civilian production, but they returned with new capabilities, new manufacturing techniques, new materials that had been developed for military purposes, and they returned to a world hungry for mobility, for normalcy, for the freedom that the automobile represented. In America, the pent-up demand was enormous. Production had been halted for years. Existing vehicles were worn out, and millions of returning servicemen wanted cars, wanted homes in new suburbs that were spreading outward from city centers, wanted to participate in the prosperity that the war's end seemed to promise, and the manufacturers responded. Detroit roared back to life. Assembly lines that had been silent or turned to military production now churned out cars in numbers that dwarfed anything from before the war. The designs of the late 1940s and early 1950s reflected a new optimism, a sense of possibility. Chrome gleamed everywhere. Bumpers became more elaborate. Grills grew larger and more ornate. Tail fins appeared, inspired by aircraft design, suggesting speed and modernity. Cars grew longer, lower, wider. Horsepower increased. V8 engines became common even in middle-class vehicles, and gasoline was cheap, abundant. No one worried about consumption, about efficiency. The focus was on power, on style, on making a statement. Automatic transmissions became widespread, eliminating the need to shift gears manually, making driving easier, more accessible. Power steering appeared, power brakes. Features that had once been luxuries became standard, and with each innovation, the automobile became more comfortable, more isolated from the road, more like a living room on wheels than the open Spartan vehicles of earlier decades. The interstate highway system began to take shape in America, a massive infrastructure project that would crisscross the continent, connect every major city, make long-distance travel fast and convenient. President Eisenhower, who had seen the German Autobahn during the war, understood the strategic and economic importance of such a network, and so the highways stretched out, broad ribbons of concrete, and the automobile culture deepened. Drive-in theaters, drive-in restaurants, motels, gas stations, an entire ecosystem built around the assumption that everyone had a car, that everyone was mobile. Europe rebuilt more slowly. Resources were scarcer. Cities had been damaged. Economies were recovering. And so European cars of the post-war era were generally smaller, more economical, focused on efficiency rather than size and power. The Volkswagen Beetle, finally in full production, became a symbol of German recovery, affordable, reliable, simple. Millions were built, and it spread across Europe and eventually to America, where its very simplicity and economy made it a counterpoint to Detroit's excess. Britain produced practical vehicles like the Morris Minor and the Austin. France had the Citroën 2 Chevaux, a minimalist car designed to motorize rural France, to carry farmers to market over rough roads. It was crude, but brilliant in its way, functional, economical, perfectly suited to its purpose, and it endured for decades. Beloved despite, or perhaps because of its quirks, Italy brought style and passion. Companies like Ferrari and Maserati built exotic sports cars, beautiful and fast, while Fiat provided transportation for ordinary Italians, the Cinquecento, tiny but charming, perfect for narrow medieval streets, for a country still finding its footing economically. And these small European cars would eventually influence the entire industry, would show that bigger was not always better, that efficiency had its own appeal. The 1960s brought new energy, new ideas. The post-war babies were coming of age, and they wanted something different from their parents' cars. They wanted performance, wanted style, wanted vehicles that reflected their youth and rebellion, and the manufacturers responded. The muscle car era began. Engines grew more powerful. Designs became more aggressive. The Ford Mustang, the Chevrolet Camaro, the Pontiac GTO, cars that could accelerate with breathtaking speed, that made noise and drama, that were as much about attitude as transportation. In Europe, sports cars flourished. Jaguar's E-Type became an icon of beauty and performance. Porsche refined its rear-engine design into the legendary 911, a car that defied conventional wisdom about handling, but became one of the most successful sports cars ever built. Each manufacturer finding its own path, its own interpretation of what an automobile could be. Safety became a concern, for the first time, really. Ralph Nader's book, Unsafe at Any Speed, exposed how little attention manufacturers had paid to protecting occupants. And regulations followed. Seat belts became mandatory, then padded dashboards, collapsible steering columns, the beginnings of a framework that would eventually make cars vastly safer than those early unforgiving machines. Japan entered the global market tentatively at first. Toyota and Nissan and Honda building small economical cars that seemed unsophisticated compared to American or European vehicles. But they were reliable, they were efficient, and when the oil crisis struck in 1973, when gasoline suddenly became expensive and scarce, those Japanese cars suddenly made perfect sense. American manufacturers, caught with portfolios full of large, thirsty vehicles, struggled to respond, and Japanese market share grew and kept growing. The 1970s were difficult years for the industry. Emissions regulations were tightening, safety standards were increasing, fuel economy was suddenly critical, and the quick fixes, like adding catalytic converters and reducing compression ratios, often made cars less pleasant to drive. Power dropped, refinement suffered. It was a period of adjustment, of learning to balance competing demands, of recognizing that the era of cheap unlimited gasoline was over. But innovation continued. Fuel injection replaced carburetors, making engines more efficient and responsive. Turbocharging allowed smaller engines to produce more power. Electronics began to appear, first in simple forms: electronic ignition, then more sophisticated systems, anti-lock brakes, traction control, technologies that helped drivers maintain control in difficult situations. The 1980s brought a renaissance of sorts. Manufacturers had adapted to the new regulations, had learned to build cars that were efficient and clean, but also enjoyable. Front-wheel drive became common, saving weight and improving space efficiency. Aerodynamics became important again, not just for style, but for real improvements in fuel economy. And quality improved, especially from Japanese manufacturers who had made reliability a core principle, who had studied and refined manufacturing processes until defects became rare, until their vehicles could be counted on to run for hundreds of thousands of kilometers with minimal maintenance. Luxury evolved. German manufacturers like Mercedes-Benz and BMW combined performance with comfort, created vehicles that could cruise at high speeds on the Autobahn while coddling passengers in near silence. Lexus appeared, Toyota's luxury division, and shocked the industry with vehicles that matched or exceeded European luxury cars in refinement while undercutting them in price. The competitive landscape was shifting. The old certainties were disappearing. The 1990s saw the rise of the sport utility vehicle, a category that had existed in primitive forms for decades, but now exploded in popularity. People wanted to sit higher, wanted the perceived safety of a larger vehicle, wanted versatility, and manufacturers obliged. SUVs grew from niche products to dominant forces in the market, and with their success came new challenges. They were heavier, less efficient, and yet people wanted them, and so the industry adapted. Again, computers became integral to automobile operation. Engine management systems grew increasingly sophisticated, making millions of calculations per second, adjusting fuel delivery and ignition timing, optimizing performance and efficiency in ways that mechanical systems never could, and the electronics expanded. Navigation systems appeared, integrating GPS technology, making it nearly impossible to get lost. Entertainment systems became elaborate. The automobile was becoming not just transportation, but a mobile technology platform. Safety advanced dramatically. Airbags became standard, first for the driver, then for passengers, then side airbags, curtain airbags, a cocoon of protection that could deploy in milliseconds. Crumple zones were carefully engineered. The rigid frames of earlier cars gave way to structures designed to absorb impact, to protect occupants. Crash testing became rigorous, standardized, and fatality rates began to drop significantly, even as more cars filled the roads. The new millennium brought new concerns. Climate change was no longer a fringe worry, but a central challenge. And the automobile, responsible for a significant portion of global emissions, was scrutinized. Hybrid vehicles appeared, combining gasoline engines with electric motors. Toyota's Prius became the first mass-market hybrid, proving that efficiency need not mean sacrifice, that technology could reduce environmental impact without eliminating the utility that made cars essential. And then, quietly at first, but with growing momentum, the electric vehicle returned, not as a limited urban runabout, but as a serious alternative. Battery technology had improved enormously, energy density had increased, costs had dropped, and companies like Tesla showed that electric vehicles could be desirable, could be fast and sophisticated, could compete with traditional cars not just on environmental grounds, but on performance and technology. The automobile was entering another transformation, perhaps as significant as any that had come before. Autonomous driving systems were being developed, computers learning to navigate roads, to make decisions, to potentially eliminate the human driver altogether. Connectivity was becoming standard, vehicles talking to each other, to infrastructure, part of a larger network. The solitary machine was becoming part of a collective intelligence. And yet, despite all these changes, despite the quantum leap from those first primitive motor wagons to the sophisticated computers on wheels of today, something fundamental remained the same. The automobile was still about freedom, about choice, about the ability to go where you wanted, when you wanted. That basic promise that had driven the inventors and entrepreneurs of the 1880s, that had motivated Henry Ford, that had spread the automobile across the world. That promise endured, standing here now in this quiet space, surrounded by vehicles that span more than a century. I can see the thread that connects them all, the continuous evolution, each generation building on what came before, solving problems, creating new possibilities. And I find myself wondering not just about where we have been, but about where we are going, about what the next chapters of this story might hold. The machines around me are silent now, but they carry within them something more than metal and glass, more than the sum of their components. They carry memory, the accumulated experience of generations who dreamed of movement, who refused to accept limitation, who believed that the horizon was not a boundary but an invitation. I think about the hands that shaped the first crude engines, the minds that puzzled over combustion and timing, compression ratios and valve trains, problems that had never existed before, that required entirely new ways of thinking. And I think about how each solution created new questions, how each answer opened doors to rooms that had not even been imagined. There is something profound in this progression, this march from impossibility to inevitability, the way the automobile transformed from a curiosity that frightened horses into something so commonplace that we forget to marvel at it, forget that we are piloting machines that would have seemed like magic to our ancestors, that compress hours of travel into minutes, that carry us across landscapes with less effort than walking across a room. The social transformations ripple outward in ways that are still unfolding. The automobile did not just change how we move, it changed where we live. The suburbs could not exist without it. Those sprawling communities of single-family homes, each one requiring a car or two or three, each resident dependent on the automobile for work, for shopping, for every aspect of daily life, entire patterns of civilization reshaped by the existence of personal mechanical transportation, and the costs, both visible and hidden, the roads that carved through neighborhoods, the parking lots that consumed city centers, the air quality in urban areas, the greenhouse gases accumulating in the atmosphere, the accidents, the millions of lives lost over the decades to collisions, to mechanical failures, to human error. The automobile brought freedom, but also tragedy, brought mobility, but also consequences that we are still learning to understand, still learning to address. Yet to focus only on the negative would be to miss something essential. The automobile enabled experiences that would not otherwise have been possible. Families visiting national parks, young people finding opportunities in distant cities, goods delivered to remote areas, ambulances reaching emergencies, the connectivity that knits societies together, the economic activity that flows along highways. The very shape of modern life is inconceivable without the automobile. I walk slowly past a vehicle from the 1930s, and I imagine the person who first drove it. Imagine them feeling the power of the engine, the response of the steering, the sense of mastery over distance. And I think about how that feeling must have been even more intense for the earliest drivers. Those who remembered a world where travel meant horses or trains or walking, where spontaneous journeys were rare, where the world was necessarily smaller, the democratization of distance, that is perhaps what the automobile achieved most profoundly. Before it, long-distance travel was the province of the wealthy, of those who could afford train tickets and hotel rooms, of those who had the leisure time. But the automobile, especially as it became affordable, gave ordinary people access to geography, let them explore, let them visit relatives, let them experience landscapes they had only read about. And there is something deeply human in this desire to move, to see what lies beyond the next hill, the next valley. We are a restless species, always have been, and the automobile tapped into that restlessness, gave it a vehicle, literal and metaphorical, for expression. The engineering itself contains a kind of poetry, the way power is transmitted from combustion to motion, the choreography of pistons and crankshafts, valves opening and closing thousands of times per minute, fuel atomizing and mixing with air, sparks igniting at precisely the right moment, the heat and pressure and violence contained within the engine block, all of it coordinated, balanced, converted into the smooth rotation of wheels on pavement, and the constant refinement, the endless pursuit of efficiency, of power, of smoothness, of silence. Each generation of engineers standing on the shoulders of those who came before, learning from failures, building on successes, the accumulated knowledge growing, spreading, cross-pollinating between manufacturers and nations, competition driving innovation, collaboration sharing breakthroughs. The styling tells its own story, the way automobiles reflected the aesthetics of their eras, the Art Deco streamlining of the 30s, the exuberant chrome of the 50s, the angular aggression of the 80s, the organic curves of the 2000s, each design language speaking to the values and aspirations of its time, the automobile as cultural artifact, as expression of collective dreams. I pause before an electric vehicle from recent years, its lines smooth and minimalist, and I think about the circle closing, about how the industry is returning to electric power, but with a century of accumulated knowledge, with battery technology that the early pioneers could not have imagined, with motors that are compact and powerful and efficient. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. The same solution revisited with new understanding, new capabilities, and autonomous driving. The possibility that the automobile might drive itself, that the human role might shift from operator to passenger. This represents perhaps the most fundamental change since the automobile's invention. It challenges our relationship with these machines, asks questions about control and responsibility, about the nature of mobility itself. Are we ready to surrender the steering wheel, to trust algorithms and sensors, to become passengers in our own vehicles? These are not just technical questions. They touch on something deeper, on identity, on what it means to drive, on the connection between human and machine that has defined the automobile experience for more than a century. And yet, perhaps this too is simply evolution, the next step in a journey that began with those first tentative experiments with steam and electricity and internal combustion, all of it leading here to whatever comes next. The light has shifted, grown softer, and in this gentle dimness the vehicles seem almost to glow, as if illuminated from within by all the journeys they have made, all the miles they have traveled, all the people they have carried, and I feel a deep respect for them, not just as machines, but as monuments to human ingenuity, to persistence, to the refusal to accept the world as it is when we can imagine how it might be. We built these machines, and they built us, shaped our cities, our economies, our cultures, our very sense of what is possible. The automobile is both tool and teacher, servant and master, liberator and constraint, and understanding this complexity, holding all of these truths simultaneously. That is part of appreciating what the automobile represents, what it has meant, what it continues to mean, even as it transforms into something new. And so I stand here, in this space where past and present coexist, where the arc of automotive history is visible in metal and glass, and I feel the weight of all those years, all those innovations, all those journeys settling over me like a gentle blanket. The story is not finished. Perhaps it never will be finished as long as humans desire to move, to explore, to connect across distance. But for now, in this moment, there is peace in simply being here, in witnessing, in remembering. The vehicles rest in their places, each one a chapter in a larger narrative, and the narrative continues flowing forward like a river, like time itself, and I am content to let it flow, to let the story unfold as it will, knowing that what has been achieved is remarkable, that the journey from those first crude experiments to the sophisticated machines of today represents one of humanity's great accomplishments, not without cost, not without consequence, but undeniably transformative, undeniably profound. The air still carries that faint scent of history, of oil and rubber and old leather, and I breathe it in one more time, letting it fill my lungs, letting it connect me to all those who came before, who built and drove and dreamed these machines into existence. And I feel gratitude for their vision, for their persistence, for the world they created, the world we inherited, the world we continue to shape. And as the light fades further, as shadows lengthen across chrome and paint, I find my thoughts slowing, becoming less distinct, less urgent, like the idle of a perfectly tuned engine, a gentle rhythm that sustains itself without effort, without strain, just the natural cadence of existence, of being present in this moment, in this place, where the story of the automobile lives in every curve and surface, in every bolt and bearing, in the very air itself. The silence deepens, and in that silence there is completion, not an ending, but a resting place, a moment of stillness in the ongoing flow, and I let myself settle into it. Let the story hold me as I have held it. Let the machines and their history wash over me in gentle waves, each one carrying me further into quiet, into peace, into the soft twilight, where all journeys eventually lead, where movement gives way to stillness, where the road stretches out ahead into darkness, into mystery, into the unknowable future, and I am content simply to be here, now, in this moment, this eternal present, where past and future merge, where the story finally, gently finds its rest. I close my eyes and picture a city made of stone and light, a place where marble glows beneath the Tuscan sun, where every piazza hums with voices speaking of beauty and truth and the nature of what it means to be human. The air here is warm, carrying the scent of limestone dust and pigment, the sound of chisels against marble echoing through narrow streets, and everywhere there is this sense of awakening, as though the world itself has decided to remember something it had forgotten. This is Florence, though it could be Rome, or Venice, or any of those Italian cities where something extraordinary began to unfold in the centuries after the year 1300, a transformation so profound that we still feel its presence, still walk through museums and libraries shaped by its vision, still carry in our minds the images it created and the questions it dared to ask. The word itself, Renaissance, means rebirth, and there is something almost magical in that notion, the idea that a civilization could be born again, that after centuries of one way of seeing and thinking and creating, humanity could choose a different path, could look backward to move forward, could find in ancient ruins and forgotten texts the seeds of something entirely new. I imagine standing in a workshop, late afternoon light streaming through tall windows, illuminating particles of marble dust that hang suspended in golden air. And there is Michelangelo, or perhaps Donatello, or some other master whose name has been lost to time, but whose hands knew the secret of transforming cold stone into living flesh. The floor is covered with drawings, sketches of human bodies in motion, studies of muscles and tendons, observations of how light falls across a shoulder or gathers in the hollow of a throat, because this is what makes the Renaissance different from what came before. This obsessive attention to the world as it actually appears, to the beauty inherent in natural form, to the dignity and complexity of the human figure. On a nearby table sits a text, perhaps Plato or Cicero or Vitruvius, the pages worn from constant study, annotated in the margins with thoughts and questions in flowing script, because the artists and thinkers of this time believed that wisdom could be found in the classical past, that the Greeks and Romans had understood something essential about proportion and harmony and the proper measure of things, and that these ancient insights had been waiting, patient as seeds in winter, for the right moment to bloom again. Through the window, I can see the dome of a cathedral rising against the sky, an impossible feat of engineering that seems to defy gravity itself. proof that human ingenuity and mathematical precision could achieve what previous generations thought beyond reach and nearby, construction continues on a palazzo, its facade designed according to principles of symmetry and classical order, each column and arch placed with careful deliberation, each proportion calculated to create a sense of balance and grace. This is a world being remade by human hands and human minds, where the power to shape reality no longer belongs exclusively to the divine or the distant, but to the artist with a brush, the architect with a plan, the scholar with a question, the merchant with a vision of what might be possible. I walk through imagined streets where wool merchants and bankers discuss Aristotle over wine, where poets gather in gardens to debate the nature of love and beauty, where a young apprentice watches his master mix pigments and learns not just technique, but philosophy, the belief that art serves a higher purpose, that it can reveal truth, can capture the essence of things, can freeze a single moment of grace and make it eternal. The light is changing now, growing softer, more amber, and I think of how the people of this time must have experienced their world, how they must have felt this sense of possibility, this thrilling conviction that they were participating in something larger than themselves, that they were not merely living through their days, but actively shaping a new vision of what humanity could become. Somewhere nearby, a young man is reading Petrarch by candlelight, feeling the power of language arranged with precision and care, discovering that words themselves could be architecture, could be sculpted and refined until they revealed new dimensions of thought and feeling. And in another room, someone is studying the mathematics of perspective, learning how to create the illusion of three-dimensional space on a flat surface, discovering the geometric rules that govern how parallel lines appear to converge, how objects diminish with distance, how the human eye makes sense of depth and volume, and in this discovery finding a way to make paintings that seem to open like windows onto another world. This is where we begin, in this atmosphere of transformation and rediscovery, in this moment when Europe emerged from centuries of different concerns and different ways of being, and chose to look at humanity, at nature, at the classical past, with new eyes and renewed wonder. The story of the Renaissance is vast, spanning centuries and countries, encompassing art and architecture, philosophy and science, politics and religion, but it begins here, in these workshops and libraries, in these cities of stone and light, where individuals dared to imagine that the world could be different, and then set about making it so. The seeds of this transformation were planted long before anyone used the word Renaissance, long before Michelangelo touched chisel to marble or Leonardo sketched his impossible machines. The roots reach back to a time when Europe was emerging from what some would later call, perhaps unfairly, the Dark Ages. It begins, as so many things do, with loss and rediscovery. For centuries, the great texts of classical antiquity had been scattered, hidden, forgotten in monastery libraries where monks copied manuscripts they could barely read, preserving words in languages that few understood, maintaining traditions they no longer fully grasped, and much had been lost entirely, burned in wars, crumbled with time, or simply abandoned as the Roman Empire collapsed and new kingdoms rose from its ruins. But in the 13th and 14th centuries, something shifted, trade routes expanded, Cities grew wealthy, and with wealth came leisure, and with leisure came curiosity, particularly in the Italian peninsula, where the memory of Rome had never entirely faded, where ancient columns still stood in fields, where the language spoken in the streets was descended directly from Latin. There began to develop a hunger for the past. Petrarch, born in the year 1304, is often called the father of humanism, the movement that would become the intellectual foundation of the Renaissance. And there is something touching about his devotion to antiquity, the way he collected ancient manuscripts with the passion of a lover, the way he wrote letters to long-dead Roman authors as though they might somehow receive them across the centuries. He climbed Mount Ventoux in 1342, not for any practical reason, but simply to see the view from the summit. And in this act, there is something emblematic of the new spirit. The idea that human experience and human perception had value in themselves, that the world was worth observing, worth describing, worth understanding on its own terms. Petrarch wrote in Latin, attempting to match the elegance of Cicero, but he also wrote poetry in the vernacular in Italian, verses about his love for a woman named Laura, and in doing so, he helped establish that the common language, the language of merchants and mothers, could carry beauty and sophistication, could be a vehicle for serious literary art. This matters more than it might seem, because language shapes thought. And when writers began to craft works of philosophy and literature in Italian, in French, in English, they made these ideas accessible to people beyond the small circle of clergy and scholars who had monopolized learning for so long. In Florence, the Medici family was accumulating the wealth that would later fuel so much artistic creation, building their fortune on banking and wool trading, establishing themselves as the unofficial rulers of the city. And though their political machinations could be ruthless, they understood something crucial, that money could be transformed into beauty, into learning, into legacy. Cosimo de' Medici, who rose to power in 1434, would become one of the great patrons of the Renaissance, but even before him, Florence had been developing the conditions necessary for transformation. The city was a republic, governed by guilds and councils rather than a single hereditary ruler, and this created space for a certain kind of civic pride, a competition among wealthy families to demonstrate their refinement and vision through public works and private patronage. The wealth flowing through Italian cities came from trade, from the textile industry, from banking innovations that allowed capital to move and multiply. Florence and Venice and Milan became hubs of commerce, connecting northern Europe with the Mediterranean, the East with the West, and this commercial success created a new class of people, merchants and bankers who were neither nobles nor peasants, who had education and ambition, who wanted to see themselves reflected in art and culture. But there was another crucial element, another stream feeding this awakening, and it came from Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire. That continuation of Rome in the East had preserved Greek texts that were largely unknown in Western Europe, had maintained traditions of classical learning that had been interrupted elsewhere, and as the Ottoman Turks pressed westward, threatening the ancient city, Byzantine scholars began to migrate to Italy, bringing with them manuscripts and knowledge, teaching Greek to eager Italian students, opening windows onto Plato and Aristotle, onto mathematical treatises and philosophical dialogues that had been inaccessible for centuries. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, it was a catastrophe, the end of an empire that had stood for over 1,000 years, but it also sent a final wave of scholars and texts westward, accelerating the recovery of classical learning that was already underway. I imagine one of these manuscripts arriving in Florence, carried carefully by a scholar who has fled his conquered homeland, the pages containing Plato's dialogues, ideas about ideal forms and the nature of beauty, and the proper education of citizens, and I imagine the excitement of the Italian humanists who could finally read these texts in their original language. Who could compare different versions? Who could engage with ancient philosophy not as distant dogma, but as living conversation? This is what humanism meant, at its core, not a rejection of Christianity, but a belief that human nature and human potential were worthy of study, that the classical past offered wisdom about how to live well, how to think clearly, how to create beauty, and that this wisdom could coexist with Christian faith, could even illuminate and enrich it. The early humanists were not revolutionaries. They were scholars and teachers, men like Coluccio Salutati and Leonardo Bruni in Florence, who served as chancellors and scribes, who wrote histories and treatises, who taught young men to read Cicero and Virgil, who believed that education in classical rhetoric and ethics would create better citizens, more virtuous leaders, a more enlightened society. They studied grammar and rhetoric, logic and moral philosophy, subjects they called the studia humanitatis, the humanities, and they believed these disciplines developed the full potential of human beings, made them more eloquent, more thoughtful, more capable of participating in civic life. In art, the early stirrings of change were equally gradual, equally rooted in observation and recovery. Giotto di Bondone, who worked in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, began to paint figures with weight and volume, with human emotions visible on their faces. His frescoes in Padua show scenes from the life of Christ and the Virgin Mary, but they show them as real people in real spaces, grieving and celebrating, suffering and rejoicing, not as flat symbols on a golden background, but as beings who inhabit the world. This was revolutionary, though it happened slowly, incrementally, each artist building on the discoveries of those who came before, learning to observe how fabric drapes over a body, how light creates shadow, how distance affects the appearance of objects, how to suggest three-dimensional form on a two-dimensional surface. Brunelleschi, born in 1377, would take this even further, demonstrating the mathematical principles of linear perspective, showing that there were rules governing how space could be represented, that art could be grounded in geometry, in observation, in science. He famously designed the dome of Florence Cathedral, solving an engineering problem that had stumped architects for decades. How to span that enormous space without through the temporary wooden supports that had been traditionally used. He studied Roman ruins, examined the Pantheon, and devised a double shell dome with hidden reinforcements, a structure so innovative that people came from across Europe just to see it. Proof that human ingenuity could match or exceed the achievements of the ancients, the doors of the Florence Baptistery became the site of a famous competition in 1401. Lorenzo Ghiberti and Filippo Brunelleschi both submitted designs, relief sculptures depicting the sacrifice of Isaac, And this competition captures something essential about the early Renaissance, the way cities invested in public beauty, the way artists competed for commissions, the way technical skill and classical learning were becoming valued, celebrated, rewarded. Ghiberti won and would spend decades creating bronze doors that Michelangelo would later call worthy of being the gates of paradise, doors where figures emerge from the metal with startling realism, where perspective creates the illusion of deep space, where biblical stories unfold with dramatic power and human emotion. Donatello, Ghiberti's contemporary, pushed sculpture toward even greater naturalism. His bronze David, created sometime in the 1430s or 40s, was the first freestanding nude sculpture since antiquity, a figure that could be viewed from all sides, that celebrated the beauty of the human body without shame or apology, that drew directly on classical models while remaining entirely Christian in subject. This is the delicate balance that early Renaissance artists had to maintain. They were recovering pagan forms, celebrating human beauty and classical ideals, but they were doing so in a Christian society for Christian patrons, creating works for churches and chapels. So they had to demonstrate that these new techniques, this new vision, served sacred purposes, revealed divine truth through the representation of earthly beauty. In 1437, Fra Angelico began painting frescoes in the monastery of San Marco in Florence, cells where monks would pray and contemplate, and his paintings show this fusion perfectly. They use perspective and naturalism. They show figures with volume and weight, but they remain deeply spiritual, meditative, designed to focus the mind on holy mysteries. The early Renaissance was not a sudden break with the past. It was a gradual shift, a slow accumulation of techniques and ideas, of recovered texts and new observations, of wealth that could be channeled into art, of cities that took pride in beauty and learning, of individuals who dared to look closely at the world, at the body, at ancient ruins and forgotten manuscripts, and who found there something worth preserving, worth studying, worth making new. By the middle of the 15th century, the foundations had been laid, the tools had been developed, the intellectual framework had been established, and what would come next would be even more extraordinary, a flowering of genius so concentrated, so brilliant, that its light would illuminate centuries to come. But it all began here, with Petrarch climbing a mountain, with Giotto painting human faces, with Byzantine scholars carrying manuscripts westward, with merchants who valued beauty, with cities that competed in magnificence, with artists who looked at the world and decided to capture what they saw with unprecedented precision and care. The city hums with a particular energy now as the 15th century reaches its midpoint and then pushes forward into its second half. Florence has become something unprecedented, a crucible where genius seems to concentrate, where workshops produce masterpieces with startling regularity, where the children of craftsmen grow up to reshape how humanity sees itself. In these workshops, the process of becoming an artist follows ancient patterns of apprenticeship. A boy, perhaps 10 or 12 years old, enters the bottega of a master, and he begins with the humblest tasks, grinding pigments, preparing panels, mixing plaster for frescoes, learning through observation and repetition, absorbing not just techniques but ways of seeing. The master's studio is a place of constant activity, assistants working on different sections of a large commission, apprentices copying drawings, the master himself moving between projects, refining a face here, adjusting a composition there and everywhere, the understanding that art is work, skilled labor requiring years of practice, mathematical knowledge, understanding of materials and their properties. Pigments arrive from across the known world. Ultramarine blue made from lapis lazuli, brought from Afghanistan, so precious it costs more than gold, reserved for the robes of the Virgin Mary. Crimson from crushed insects, earth tones from ochre and umber, white from lead, black from charcoal, each color requiring specific binding mediums, specific preparation, each with its own temperament and possibilities. The apprentice learns to draw endlessly, obsessively, sketching from life, copying the master's works, studying anatomy through observation of bodies in the street, at the market, in the public baths, developing the hand-eye coordination necessary to capture form, to suggest volume through line, to create the illusion of 3 dimensions on a flat surface. Leonardo da Vinci enters Verrocchio's workshop in the early 1460s, a boy from Vinci, illegitimate son of a notary, showing such promise that his father brings him to Florence, and in that workshop, surrounded by bronze casters and painters and goldsmiths, Leonardo absorbs everything, learns painting and sculpture, mathematics and engineering, develops the insatiable curiosity that will define his life, the conviction that art and science are not separate disciplines, but different approaches to understanding the same reality. He fills notebooks with observations, drawings of water flowing, studies of birdwings in flight, anatomical sketches of extraordinary precision, designs for machines that will not be built for centuries, and his mind moves restlessly from one subject to another: painting, mathematics, geology, anatomy, botany, never satisfied, always probing deeper, seeking the principles underlying appearances. In 1472, Leonardo is accepted into the Painters' Guild, a master in his own right. But he continues working in Verrocchio's shop, and there is a story, perhaps apocryphal, but revealing nonetheless, that when Leonardo painted an angel in Verrocchio's Baptism of Christ, the master was so struck by the quality of his student's work, so humbled by the superiority of that single figure, that he vowed never to paint again. Whether true or not, the story captures something essential about this moment, the sense that a new standard was emerging, that these young artists were achieving things their masters had not imagined possible. Sandro Botticelli paints his Birth of Venus in the 1480s, and the painting is startling in its beauty and its boldness, a goddess emerging from the sea on a shell, naked except for her flowing hair, surrounded by winds and seasons rendered with lyrical grace. It is mythology made visible, pagan subject matter treated with reverence and sophistication, designed for a private chamber in the Medici villa, evidence of how classical themes had become not just acceptable, but celebrated among the sophisticated elite. The painting's linear grace, its emphasis on flowing contour and decorative beauty, represents one approach to Renaissance art, but there are others, and in the variety of styles and approaches, we see the richness of this moment, the sense that multiple visions could coexist, that there was not one correct way to capture reality, but many possible interpretations. In Rome, the papacy is asserting itself as a patron of unprecedented ambition, Pope Sixtus IV commissions the chapel that will bear his name, the Sistine Chapel, completed in 1481, and he brings the leading painters of Florence to decorate its walls, Botticelli and Ghirlandaio and Perugino, creating scenes from the lives of Moses and Christ, establishing Rome as a rival to Florence in artistic achievement. The political landscape of Italy in this period is fragmented and volatile, a patchwork of city-states and territories, republics and duchies, all competing for power and prestige. Milan under the Sforza family, Venice with its maritime empire, Rome under papal control, Naples in the south, and Florence, nominally a republic but effectively controlled by the Medici, who have mastered the art of wielding power without holding official titles. Lorenzo de' Medici, called the Magnificent, rules Florence from 1469 until his death in 1492, and he embodies the Renaissance ideal, poet and patron, politician and philosopher, a man who writes love sonnets and negotiates treaties, who collects ancient manuscripts and sponsors artists, who understands that cultural achievement is itself a form of political power, that beauty and learning enhance a city's reputation more effectively than armies. Under Lorenzo's patronage, Florence becomes a magnet for talent. Philosophers gather at the Platonic Academy he supports, discussing the relationship between Christian theology and classical philosophy, attempting to synthesize Plato and Christ, to demonstrate that ancient wisdom and revealed religion could illuminate each other. Marsilio Ficino translates Plato's complete works into Latin, making them accessible to scholars across Europe, and his commentaries attempt to show how Platonic ideals of beauty and truth point toward Christian understanding of the divine, how the love of earthly beauty can lead the soul toward love of God, how philosophy and theology are complementary paths to wisdom. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola writes his oration on the dignity of man in 1486, arguing that human beings occupy a unique position in creation, neither purely spiritual like angels, nor purely material like animals, but possessing the freedom to shape themselves, to rise or fall through their own choices, and this idea that humans are self-determining, capable of achieving excellence through will and effort, becomes central to Renaissance thought. But even as Florence flourishes, darker currents are moving beneath the surface. In 1478, the Pazzi conspiracy attempts to overthrow Medici rule. Assassins attack Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano during Easter Mass in the cathedral. Giuliano is killed, Lorenzo barely escapes, and the failed coup leads to brutal reprisals, bodies hanging from windows, conspirators hunted and executed. A reminder that this world of beauty and learning is also a world of violence and intrigue. The political tensions eventually create space for a different kind of voice, Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar whose sermons denounce the worldliness and luxury of Florentine life, who calls for moral reform, for the burning of vanities, for the rejection of pagan influences, and after Lorenzo's death, Savonarola briefly dominates Florence, and there are bonfires of paintings and books, of mirrors and cosmetics, of anything deemed frivolous or sinful, before he himself is arrested, excommunicated, hanged and burned in 1498. This conflict between religious rigor and classical humanism, between ascetic rejection of the world and celebration of earthly beauty, runs throughout the Renaissance, creating tension but also creative energy. forcing artists and thinkers to justify their work, to demonstrate how beauty serves truth, how the study of nature reveals divine design. Meanwhile, in Milan, Leonardo has entered the service of Ludovico Sforza, offering his skills as engineer and artist, and in the refectory of the monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie, he paints the Last Supper, working slowly, experimentally, using an oil tempera mixture on dry plaster instead of traditional fresco technique, seeking greater control, more time to refine and adjust. The painting shows Christ and his disciples at the moment he announces that one of them will betray him, and Leonardo captures not a single frozen instant, but a wave of reaction rippling through the group, shock and denial and questioning, each figure with distinct personality and gesture. The composition organized through perspective lines that converge on Christ's head, drawing the eye inexorably to the calm center of the storm. It is deteriorating even as he paints it, his experimental technique proving unstable. But the power of the composition, the psychological depth, the mastery of space and gesture make it immediately legendary, copied and studied by generations of artists who journey to Milan specifically to see it. In 1499, Leonardo fills a notebook page with calculations, trying to determine the quantity of stone removed in excavating the foundation for the Milan Cathedral, and on the same page he sketches mechanisms, studies shadows, drafts a letter, his mind moving fluidly between mathematics and engineering, art and science, seeing connections everywhere, understanding that the same principles govern the flight of birds and the flow of water, the structure of the human body and the proportions of buildings. He dissects corpses, dozens of them, making anatomical drawings of breathtaking precision and beauty, mapping muscles and blood vessels, studying the mechanism of the heart, the structure of the eye, seeking to understand how bodies work, how vision occurs, how life maintains itself. And he does this not just from scientific curiosity, but because he believes that to paint the body convincingly, one must understand its interior architecture, must know what lies beneath the skin. At the turn of the century, as the 1400s become the 1500s, the center of artistic gravity begins shifting toward Rome. A new pope, Julius II, has ambitions to make Rome the greatest city in Christendom, to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica, to fill the Vatican with art that will proclaim the power and glory of the Church. He summons Michelangelo Buonarroti, who has already established his reputation with the Pietà in St. Peter's, a sculpture of the dead Christ in Mary's lap, carved when Michelangelo was barely into his 20s, showing technical virtuosity that seems almost superhuman, the way he renders flesh in marble, the way he drapes fabric, the way he captures both grief and acceptance in Mary's face. Julius wants Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, but Michelangelo considers himself primarily a sculptor, resists the commission, tries to refuse, but the Pope is not a man who accepts refusal, and so Michelangelo designs scaffolding, mixes his plasters, and begins the work that will consume 4 years of his life, lying on his back on the scaffolding, paint dripping into his eyes, working by candlelight. He covers over 10,000 square feet of ceiling with scenes from Genesis, the creation of Adam, the fall of man, the flood, and surrounding these central narratives, prophets and sibyls, figures of such power and scale that they seem to burst from their painted frames. Nudes of extraordinary beauty and anatomical precision, the whole ceiling organized into a complex architectural framework that uses the actual curve of the vault, that creates the illusion of structure while remaining entirely painted. The moment when God's finger reaches toward Adam's, both hands extended in that tiny gap that separates divine and human, has become one of the most recognized images in Western art. But it is just one detail in a vast theological program, a meditation on creation and fall, on prophecy and salvation, on the relationship between God and humanity. Michelangelo works with minimal assistance, dismissing the helpers the Pope provides, doing most of the painting himself, driven by a vision of perfection, by the belief that the image exists already in his mind, needs only to be revealed, and the physical toll is enormous. But when it is finished in 1512, it establishes a standard that will define high Renaissance art, a synthesis of classical beauty and Christian narrative, of anatomical knowledge and spiritual meaning, of technical mastery and visionary imagination. The years that follow become a cascade of masterpieces, as though some dam has broken and genius flows freely through Italian cities, Rome and Florence and Venice, all producing works that will define Western art for centuries, and the artists themselves become celebrities, their lives document, their personalities debated, their works commanding prices that make them wealthy men. Raphael Sanzio arrives in Rome in 1508, called by Pope Julius II to decorate the Vatican apartments, and though he is younger than Michelangelo and Leonardo, though he has studied their works and absorbed their lessons, he brings his own gifts, a grace and harmony that seems effortless, a sweetness of expression that never becomes saccharine, a mastery of composition that makes even complex scenes appear natural and inevitable. In the Stanza della Segnatura, one of the papal chambers, Raphael paints the School of Athens, a fresco showing the great philosophers of antiquity gathered in a magnificent architectural space. Plato and Aristotle at the center, one pointing upward toward ideal forms, the other gesturing toward the earth and empirical observation, and surrounding them, Pythagoras and Euclid, Heraclitus and Diogenes, each figure individualized, each engaged in debate or contemplation or teaching. It is a vision of intellectual community, of wisdom as collective endeavor, and it demonstrates how completely classical philosophy has been integrated into Christian culture. These pagan thinkers painted on the wall of the Pope's private library, celebrated as seekers of truth, whose insights complement rather than contradict revealed religion. Raphael reportedly uses his contemporaries as models, painting Michelangelo's face onto Heraclitus, Leonardo's features onto Plato, even including his own portrait among the figures on the right, and this collapsing of past and present, this suggestion that Renaissance thinkers are the legitimate heirs of ancient philosophers, captures something essential about how this period understood itself. In Venice, a different aesthetic is developing, one less concerned with linear precision and sculptural form, more interested in color and atmosphere, in the play of light on surfaces, in the sensuous beauty of paint itself. Titian, who will dominate Venetian painting for most of the 16th century, uses color with unprecedented boldness, building up layers of pigment, allowing earlier layers to show through, creating surfaces that seem to glow from within. His paintings of mythological subjects, of Venus and Diana and Bacchus celebrate physical beauty without apology, the human body rendered with such loving attention that the paintings themselves become objects of desire. Venice is different from Florence and Rome, a maritime republic whose wealth comes from trade with the East, whose architecture reflects Byzantine influence, whose climate is humid, softening colors, making everything shimmer and blur at the edges, and Venetian painting develops qualities that match the city itself, a love of luxury and spectacle, rich fabrics and jewels, scenes of pageantry and celebration. Giovanni Bellini, Titian's teacher, paints altarpieces where sacred figures are set in landscapes of extraordinary beauty, where the natural world becomes a meditation on divine creation, where light itself seems holy, and this integration of religious subject matter with careful observation of nature. This sense that the visible world reveals spiritual truth runs throughout Renaissance art, justifying the attention to material beauty, the study of light and color and form. But as the 16th century progresses, as the High Renaissance reaches its peak, new tensions begin to emerge. The Protestant Reformation explodes across Northern Europe, challenging papal authority, questioning the very foundations of the Church, and the unity of Christendom fractures irreparably. Martin Luther posts his 95 Theses in 1517, arguing against indulgences, against the corruption he sees in the church hierarchy, and his words, printed and distributed, translated and debated, spread with unprecedented speed. The printing press, perfected by Gutenberg in the mid-1400s, has transformed the circulation of ideas, made it impossible to contain dissent, to control what people read and think. The Reformation creates a crisis for Renaissance humanism. Many humanists had criticized church corruption, had called for reform, had emphasized individual conscience and direct engagement with Scripture, but most had not intended schism, had hoped for renewal within the church, and now they must choose sides or attempt the increasingly difficult task of remaining neutral in a polarizing conflict. In 1527, the unthinkable happens. Imperial troops, many of them Lutheran mercenaries, sack Rome, killing, looting, desecrating churches, holding the Pope prisoner, and the catastrophe sends shockwaves through Italy, shatters the sense that Rome is inviolable, that the Church can protect those under its authority, that the Renaissance project of cultural renewal will continue undisturbed. Artists and intellectuals scatter, seeking new patrons, new cities, new certainties in a world that suddenly seems unstable, and the art that follows begins to show strain, a restlessness, a movement away from the balanced harmonies of the High Renaissance towards something more turbulent and expressive. Michelangelo returns to the Sistine Chapel in 1536, now an old man, painting the Last Judgment on the altar wall, and it is a vision of apocalypse, of bodies rising and falling, of the saved and the damned sorted by divine judgment, Christ as muscular judge rather than suffering Savior. The whole composition a writhing mass of humanity facing ultimate reckoning, and the mood is darker, more anxious, reflecting perhaps the uncertainties of the age, the sense that the stable world of the early Renaissance has given way to something more chaotic and dangerous. The Church responds to Protestant challenge with the Counter-Reformation, with the Council of Trent beginning in 1545, reforming abuses but also enforcing orthodoxy, tightening control over what can be painted and written, insisting that art serve clear didactic purposes, that it inspire devotion rather than aesthetic pleasure, that it avoid anything that might seem frivolous or sensual. Some works are censored, deemed too provocative, too pagan in their celebration of physical beauty. Michelangelo's nudes in the Sistine Chapel are painted over with drapery, modest loincloths added to cover what had been celebrated as divine craftsmanship, and artists must navigate these new restrictions, must justify their work in explicitly religious terms, must demonstrate that beauty serves faith rather than competing with it. Yet the techniques and insights of the Renaissance spread northward. Albrecht Dürer travels to Italy, absorbs lessons of proportion and perspective, brings them back to Germany, his prince disseminating Italian innovations across Europe. His theoretical writings explaining the mathematics underlying Renaissance art, making the knowledge available to any artist who can read. In France, King Francis I invites Leonardo to his court, the aging master spending his final years in the Loire Valley, bringing with him the Mona Lisa, that portrait of a Florentine merchant's wife that has become perhaps the most famous painting in the world. Her enigmatic expression, her hands folded calmly, the mysterious landscape behind her, all rendered with sfumato, that technique of subtle gradations, of edges that blur and soften, creating an impression of life and breath, of a consciousness behind the eyes. Leonardo dies in 1519, leaving notebooks filled with observations and inventions, treatises on painting and anatomy, studies of mechanics and hydraulics, a mind that ranged across all knowledge, seeking the fundamental principles, the underlying order. And though many of his projects remained unfinished, though he completed relatively few paintings, his influence permeates the Renaissance, his conviction that art and science are united, that observation leads to understanding, that the patient study of nature reveals truth. The Italian Renaissance begins to shade into something else, into mannerism, into Baroque, the clarity and balance of the high Renaissance giving way to more complex compositions, more emotional intensity, more dramatic uses of light and shadow, artists like Pontormo and Bronzino creating works of sophisticated artifice, elongated figures, unusual colors, compositions that call attention to their own cleverness, their departure from natural appearance, but the Renaissance spirit, the commitment to human dignity and potential, the recovery of classical learning, the development of techniques for representing three-dimensional space, the integration of observation and theory, all of this becomes the foundation for European culture, shapes how artists will work for centuries, establishes standards and aspirations that remain influential even now. In 1564, Michelangelo dies in Rome, having lived through almost the entire arc of the High Renaissance and its aftermath, having known Leonardo and Raphael, having worked for popes and princes, having transformed sculpture and painting and architecture, leaving behind works of such power that they continue to move viewers, to inspire awe, to demonstrate what human hands and human vision can achieve. The workshops continue. The techniques pass from master to apprentice, but something has shifted. The concentration of genius that characterized Florence and Rome in those decades around 1500 proves impossible to sustain, impossible to replicate. And gradually, the Renaissance becomes history rather than living present, becomes something to study and honor rather than something to participate in and extend. Yet its legacy spreads across Europe, shapes the Northern Renaissance in the Netherlands and Germany, influences the development of art and thought in France and England and Spain, the humanist emphasis on education, on the study of classical texts, on the dignity and potential of human beings becomes part of how Europe understands itself, how it educates its young, how it justifies its intellectual and artistic endeavors. The universities incorporate humanist curricula, teaching rhetoric and moral philosophy alongside theology. The printing press makes books affordable, makes classical text available to anyone who can read, and literacy spreads, slowly but inexorably, changing how knowledge circulates, how ideas develop and evolve. The Renaissance becomes a reference point, a standard of excellence, and later ages will look back to it, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with critique, recognizing both its achievements and its limitations, its celebration of human potential and its frequent exclusion of those deemed less than fully human, its recovery of classical wisdom and its sometimes uncritical acceptance of classical hierarchies. But in those workshops and studios, in those libraries and academies, in those churches and palaces where artists and thinkers pursued their visions with such intensity and devotion, something remarkable happened, a transformation in how humanity understood itself, a flowering of creativity that demonstrated what becomes possible when wealth and learning, technique and vision, curiosity and discipline all align, even briefly, even imperfectly, creating beauty that endures across centuries, asking questions that each generation must answer anew. There is something worth contemplating in the Renaissance understanding of imitation, the idea that seemed paradoxical to later ages, that originality could emerge from copying, that one learned to see by reproducing what others had seen, that apprentices spent years drawing the same hands, the same drapery folds, the same classical statues, until their hands knew the form so completely that invention became possible. This is different from how modern culture often thinks about creativity. The romantic notion of the isolated genius producing ex nihilo, from nothing, the artist who rejects all influence and creates purely from internal vision. But Renaissance artists understood that mastery required submission, that freedom came through discipline, that you earned the right to innovate by first proving you could replicate. Leonardo's notebooks show this clearly. Pages filled with studies of hands in every possible position, sketches of water flowing over obstacles, observations of how fabric behaves when draped over a sphere. He is teaching himself to see, training his hand to capture what his eye perceives, building a vocabulary of forms that he can later deploy, combine, transform into something unprecedented. And there is humility in this approach, the recognition that the artist stands in a tradition, that countless others have confronted these same problems, that wisdom accumulates across generations, that even genius builds on what came before. The Renaissance recovered this from classical culture. The idea of building on foundations laid by predecessors, of engaging in dialogue with the past, and in doing so, it created something that felt both ancient and entirely new, a synthesis that honored tradition while pushing beyond it. Consider how they thought about perspective, not merely as a trick for creating illusion, but as a window onto truth, a way of organizing reality according to mathematical principles, of demonstrating that the visible world operates according to discoverable laws, that human perception itself can be understood, quantified, replicated. When Brunelleschi demonstrated linear perspective, when he showed that parallel lines appear to converge at a vanishing point, when he proved that there are rules governing how objects diminish with distance, he was doing more than solving an artistic problem. He was asserting that reality is knowable, that human reason can penetrate appearances and grasp underlying structure. This conviction that observation and mathematics could reveal truth would eventually lead to modern science, to Galileo studying motion and Kepler mapping planetary orbits, to Newton formulating the laws of universal gravitation, the Renaissance belief in human capacity to understand the world through careful study and logical reasoning opened doors that would never fully close again. But there was always this dual nature to Renaissance thought, this coexistence of sacred and secular, of Christian devotion and pagan celebration, of ascetic discipline and sensuous pleasure. And the tension between these poles generated creative energy, forced artists and thinkers to justify their work, to explain how beauty serves truth, how the study of nature reveals divine design. Michelangelo could spend years carving David, celebrating the perfection of the male nude, the potential power contained in a young body, and he could do this for a Christian city, for placement outside a church, because the statue could be understood as showing divine creation, humanity made in God's image, the biblical hero as embodiment of civic virtue and holy purpose. The same artist could paint the Sistine ceiling, filling it with nudes of astonishing beauty, athletes and ancestors, sibyls and prophets, all rendered with such attention to anatomy, to the play of muscles beneath skin, to the beauty of physical form. And this too could be sacred art, because the body was understood as divine handiwork, as proof of God's creative power, as worthy of study and celebration precisely because it revealed the infinite skill of its maker. This integration, this refusal to separate body and soul, matter and spirit, earthly beauty and heavenly truth, characterizes Renaissance humanism at its best. The conviction that all aspects of human experience, all forms of knowledge, all expressions of creativity could be brought into relationship, could illuminate each other, could serve both temporal and eternal purposes. And there is something deeply appealing in this vision, this refusal of false dichotomies, this embrace of complexity and nuance. Even as we recognize that the reality often fell short of the ideal, that the people of the Renaissance were as flawed and conflicted as any other generation, that their society had hierarchies and exclusions we now find troubling. Still, the aspiration itself, the vision of integrated knowledge and holistic culture, remains compelling. The workshops where apprentices learned their craft were also schools of philosophy, places where young people absorbed not just techniques, but values, ways of thinking about quality and excellence, about the relationship between effort and achievement, about the dignity of skilled work, about the possibility of creating beauty that would outlast its makers. And perhaps this is part of why Renaissance art continues to move us, why tourists still crowd into the Uffizi and the Vatican, why reproductions of these paintings hang in homes around the world, why we still use these works to think about what it means to be human, because they embody this vision of human potential, this belief that through discipline and vision, through careful observation and technical mastery, through devotion to craft and openness to beauty, individuals can create things of lasting value, can participate in something larger than themselves, can leave behind evidence of what humans, fallible and mortal as we are, can nevertheless achieve. The Renaissance reminds us that culture is made, that it requires patronage and support, that it emerges from specific material conditions, wealthy cities and trade routes, social structures that create space for learning and art, individuals willing to dedicate resources to beauty rather than only to utility or defense. It shows us that transformation happens through accumulation, through many people making small advances, sharing techniques, building on each other's discoveries. That genius emerges from communities, from workshops and academies, from conversations and competitions, from the fertile chaos of cities where different traditions meet and mingle, and it demonstrates that what we call progress is neither inevitable nor linear, that capabilities can be lost as well as gained, that the techniques Giotto developed were forgotten for centuries before being recovered. That knowledge must be actively preserved, taught, passed forward, or it vanishes like smoke. Standing now in imagination before these works, before the David or the School of Athens or the Birth of Venus, I feel the accumulated weight of centuries, the countless viewers who have stood in these same spots, who have lifted their eyes toward painted ceilings or gazed at marble bodies, who have felt themselves in the presence of something that exceeds ordinary experience. The paint has faded, the marble has weathered. Restoration work continues endlessly, fighting against time and pollution and the simple entropy that breaks down all human creations, and yet they persist. These works that emerge from workshops in Florence and Rome, from the minds and hands of individuals whose names we know, whose faces we can see in self-portraits, whose struggles and triumphs are documented in contracts and letters and the memories of contemporaries. They lived in a different world, one without electricity or engines, without photography or digital reproduction, a world where images were rare and precious, where seeing a painting meant traveling to where it hung, where the experience of art was always embedded in physical space, in specific light and architecture, in the ritual of pilgrimage and presence. We have lost that scarcity, that sense of art as rare encounter. We can call up these images on screens, can zoom into details the original viewers could never see, can compare works from different cities and decades with effortless ease, and something is gained in this accessibility, this democratization of beauty, but something is also lost. The awe of encountering these works in their intended contexts, the way the Last Judgment fills the entire altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, the way the dome of Florence Cathedral dominates the city skyline, the way these works were meant to be experienced as part of life, not isolated in museums, but integrated into churches and palaces, into the fabric of daily existence. The Renaissance becomes for us a kind of touchstone, a moment we return to when thinking about human possibility, about what civilization can achieve when conditions align, when wealth and talent, patronage and vision all converge, and perhaps we idealize it, perhaps we project onto it qualities it never fully possessed. Perhaps we forget the violence and inequality that coexisted with the beauty, the wars and conspiracies, the exclusions and hierarchies. But even acknowledging these complications, these shadows, there remains something worth honoring in what was accomplished, in the recovery of learning, in the development of techniques that allowed artists to capture human emotion and physical form with unprecedented precision, in the vision of human dignity and potential, in the belief that through education and effort, through discipline and creativity, individuals could elevate themselves, could participate in the creation of beauty and the pursuit of truth. The light is fading now in this imagined journey, the workshops falling quiet as evening comes to Florence, to Rome, to Venice, the apprentices putting away their brushes and pigments, the masters stepping back from their work, satisfied or frustrated, planning tomorrow's efforts, and in the churches and palaces, the frescoes and altarpieces settle into shadows, waiting for dawn to reveal them again, to bring visitors who will stand before them, who will look up at painted ceilings or carved marble and feel, if only for a moment, lifted beyond themselves, connected to something larger, to the accumulated striving and achievement of generations, to the evidence that humans can create beauty that endures. And this is what the Renaissance offers us still, not just the works themselves, though they remain astonishing, but the example, the demonstration that transformation is possible, that cultures can renew themselves through engagement with the past, that beauty and learning matter, that individuals with vision and skill can shape how entire civilizations see themselves, can create works that speak across centuries, that continue to move and inspire and challenge long after their makers have returned to dust. The story does not truly end. The Renaissance flows into Baroque and Neoclassicism, into Romanticism and Modernism, into every subsequent artistic movement that has had to define itself in relation to this moment, that has had to decide what to keep and what to reject, what to honor and what to transform. And the conversation continues, quiet as evening, persistent as light, returning each dawn, reminding us of what humans have made and what we might yet make if we have the vision to see, the courage to attempt, the discipline to persist in pursuit of beauty, in service of truth, in celebration of all we are and might become